Oh my god.
In Huddersfield, but it's like a cultural backwater. I mean, that's why I'm on the internet. You know, that's why I'm doing my thing with like the YouTube stuff.
So is it like a suburb, or what does your place look like?
No, it's an urban centre. This town called Huddersfield, which is a West Yorkshire, which is northern England town, and it's a quite. I mean, it's seen better days. Let's put it that way. You know, Tory austerity has hit it pretty poorly. I mean, just in terms of the high streets, anyway. It's pitiful, and Brexit is not going to do it any favors either. But it really is a cultural backwater. We have an art gallery which has some paintings in it, which are no, but it mainly just no culture. You know, and the best thing you get is like the craft fairs, and they're always a bit like, we all know what to expect from that.
Is it like the equivalent of like the Rust Belt in the United States, where we had, a bunch of places that used to have factories no longer do?
Yeah, the North was the industrial strength of Britain in that sense. All the steel came from Sheffield, during the days of sort of industrialization and what have you, and all that's gone. I mean, you travel down the length of Yorkshire, it's like these gutted factories, these skeletons, they're just on empty. Just where I used to live in Home Bridge, we lived in the shadow of this derelict mill. It's quite impressionable, I guess.
I used to love that as an aesthetic, though. In Brooklyn, we had a bunch of, still do, right? A bunch of factories are either closed or, perhaps are just being used as warehouses now, or just sometimes, just completely empty. I used to always love that aesthetic.
There's a beauty to urban decay. There's a beauty to kind of like charred urban edifices, but but even that can be quite glamorous. I mean, I go into McDonald's. If you've been in the McDonald's the last 5 years, you'll notice it's different now from all the fluorescent lighting, and they put up like wallpaper of bricks with graffiti drawn on it. Do you know what I mean? They put up like Brooklyn tenement facades, to make it feel urban and gritty, and I suppose quite hip hop or whatever. It can have kind of its own sort of stylishness to it, I guess.
Yeah. Well, maybe internationally it's a bit different. Nothing really fancy happens in the Pizza Huts or the McDonald's like around here. But for example, if you go to China, the Pizza Huts are like, very fancy restaurants where people show up for like, business meetings and shit like that.
That's interesting.
I've always loved that aesthetic, right? In Brooklyn, partly because it was one of these things where you could keep sort of at arm's length, right? Because you don't have to deal with the fallout from all that, or at least I didn't, right? Whereas to somebody else watching that, that could be kind of like, I can imagine if you're like someone in your 60s or 70s. With the way that New York City used to be, you're watching, a chapter in your own history, not only closed, but just be, completely gutted, right? That would be a very different set of experiences. Whereas like for me, it's always this, kind of almost like an alien landscape from the beginning, since I never really had to be a part of it anyway, other than as a spectator.
It's like I've moved through urban and rural places all my life, and it's weird the sort of recalibration that goes on, I think, when you're like, in an urban space where you're traveling down canyons all the time to a rural space of big sky and sort of wide open spaces. That was always jarring to me, going back and forth when I was a student from Manchester and back to Home Valley. Just it was like sort of being Dorothy, sort of go in the cyclone in a way. You just go into a whole different world, from a world of urban decay and detritus and that sort of world, to the world of green and landscape.
I've always been like Woody Allen in the sense that he can't, he wants to be in the city, he wants to be able to walk through cities, and I've been like that most of my life, still am.
I've seen a lot of people. I've been trying to read other people's writing about Woody Allen to sort of prepare for this. And it's weird, the sort of arguments that go on. Some people say, oh, Woody Allen, he's a great poet of the city. And other people say, no, you don't understand. He's parodying and pastiching. It's an insincere kind of affection. And it's weird to see that going on back and forth through all his films, especially in a film like Manhattan, which begins with the big parade, fireworks, sort of a montage, and then later with what was it called again? Midnight in Paris, and that whole film kind of being about idealizing times, places, cities, what have you. And so it's a tricky one. I mean, what do you think about Woody Allen, like, and the way that kind of he's always drawn to the urban spaces and the city centers? Is it just because it's a world that's familiar to him, or is there something deeper about the cities and the psychogeography of cities in his films?
Well, first of all, I would ask you, like, do you think that dichotomy that you brought up, that you see critics discussing, right? Either he's doing this parody pastiche, or it's some sort of a celebration. Like, do you accept that these are the two lenses to view this through? Because I've never really accepted that. It seems like it misses the mark in terms of what he's actually been doing in a lot of cases. Although they could seem like the opposing extremes of the way in which people could read sort of Woody Allen's, either as being, one could say that generally artists portray themselves as either ironists or sincerists, and I think generally, people aren't really sure whether Woody Allen is ironizing something or whether he's being sincere about something. And I don't agree that it's always the case that it will be cut and dry, one or the either, or even if the artist will be conscious of this. But like, in your opinion, like, do you think like when it comes to the cities that he's singing, that he's singing a big song of these cities, or is it more of or is he trying to make us think more about how we celebrate cities? Well, I mean, we're going to be talking a lot more about this specifically. Like, with Midnight in Paris, I'm just wondering, like, to what degree is a character like Gil, to what degree is he just this like no talent hack? To what degree is he supposed to be, a talented artist that is just trying to break out of all the circumstances that conspire, against his greatness or whatever? Or is it something else? Like, generally, I found, like, to use Manhattan as an example, I'm not sure if you've read my essay in Manhattan from my Woody Allen reel to reel book, but in that essay, I basically talk about how, when I'm going through all the reviews of this film, almost everybody is focusing on like the cliche that was always uttered. Like, it's like essay after essay is using the same phrase, and you just first of all wonder, how are you okay with just like using the exact same like trope and cliche again and again and again that you see everybody else using? But the idea is it's a love letter, right, to Manhattan, love right? Yeah. And I mean, from the very beginning, the film strikes me as we have I forget the name of Woody Allen's character in Manhattan, but he's
calling Woody Allen. It's Woody Allen, isn't it?
So I mean, this guy's a real piece of shit, and everybody around him, though, is not aware of that. They have fully bought into what he's doing, to the way that he's viewing life.
Well, he's a piece of shit, but like he's a kind of a nice person insofar as his relationships. I mean, no one. It's a bit like, and I know later on we'll get onto Pygmalion and stuff, but Henry Higgins, in a certain context, Henry Higgins is quite funny and witty in the life of the party. In other contexts, he's evil. I think that's Woody in film to a T.
Well, I'm not sure to what degree I'd call him even, nice. I guess maybe in some ways he's nice. I mean, he's nice to the Marion Hemingway character, but that's because he wants to fuck her, right? And he wants to have threesomes with her, and he wants this and he wants that. And I mean, like, even in that film, there's this very, very quick line of dialogue that you could miss just very fast, where I forget whether he admits to it or someone accuses him of trying to run over his ex-wife with the car, and he's playing it off as an accident, and it's meant to be humorous, but that's because it's in the universe of a comedy, right? Real life is not a comedy. You're sort of left assuming that perhaps he did try to either intentionally or subconsciously essentially murder his ex-wife. So there's like a lot of stuff like that, right? So I mean, again and again, he behaves in a way that completely bellies and is bellied by all the beautiful imagery of Manhattan. And it's also interesting in the sense that, you know, a lot of similar films from a similar time period, like Taxi Driver, they show a very different side of Manhattan, right? He always focuses on, usually focuses on
The
like
most bourgeois
yeah,
parts of
yeah, like
Manhattan, the gentrified part.
exactly, yeah, and you know, like the yuppie side of things,
Yes.
he's interested in seeing how, you know, upper class neuroses tend to play out, which it's interesting to me because I mean,
But like just before I forget, like you're like talking about like his like dubious morality or what have you, like there just seems to be the sense with not just Manhattan but other films as well that, you know, and maybe it's a kind of a chauvinistic thing on the character's part. How great I am, you know, how deep I am, how wonderful I am. But it does seem to be that some way in relationships, the woman he's with is in some way her life is improved by meeting Woody Allen or other people, even if they do become his enemies. They see some kind of improvement in their life, you know, a bit like Eliza from Pygmalion, kind of like some kind of improvement happens that kind of, you get the sense that people tolerate him for this very reason. Even the person he, you know, his new wife, his ex-wife's new lover, like even they kind of put up with him. But you get the sense that, you know, this isn't, you know, we're not supposed to, even that's morally ambiguous. You know, can they, maybe they don't see the real depth of kind of his problems, his neuroses, you know, his violence, his what have you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a possibility, and I wasn't expecting because when we were exchanging notes for this show, you mentioned that the Pygmalion lens, which is I think it's a good way of viewing this. So for audience members that don't know, Pygmalion is it's a Greek myth. It was also interpreted by Ovid in the Metamorphoses.
Yeah.
The myth in Ovid is basically so Pygmalion is a sculptor. He hates women because he sees like women engaging in prostitution and just sort of having loose morals. So he becomes like a complete woman hater. And the only woman that he ever falls in love with, right? He's living as a bachelor, is the one that he sculpts, right? So he's able to sculpt this thing that is, you know, the only woman that he's capable of loving, right? And then she, yeah, and he you know, he prays to Venus for you know, to bring her to life. This is what happens. So you know, it you know, just like Mr.
Like, that's the Greek myth, and you have the George Bernard Shaw play, which I think is probably the core text here for like looking at, because a great deal of his films, Woody Allen, a great deal of his films are kind of adaptations of Pygmalion, in my opinion, or there is a very strong Pygmalion theme. Some works like Mighty Aphrodite or Annie Hall, for instance, these are very Pygmalion film where he is Henry Higgins and the woman is Eliza Doolittle, and it plays out like that. But obviously there are some twists, there's maybe some genre deconstruction, some ironic distance, some, you know, emotional depth that we perhaps don't get from the stiff, buttoned up late Victorian sentiments of Shaw. You know, so I think that's a key text as well, much more than the Greek myth. But
I was about to actually
the idea of the
transition to
artist.
Shaw,
but the idea of the artist who creates, you know, like creates something to control it, but then finding the things beyond its control and, you know, what have you, and the conflicting ethics there with the dynamics of power, you know, patrilineal power, sort of male power over women and what women's suffrage. These are big themes in those kind of films too, even if they're played quite lightly and comically. You know, you know, I don't want what I want. Kind of that's the exaggerated stereotype we get from Woody Allen films. You know, like the sort of the klutzy kind of woman, like played by Diane Keaton.
Yeah. I was going to make the transition into a Bernard Shaw's Pygmalion, and so like, I mean, like
I know I jumped the shark.
Well, I mean, like the Ovid poem doesn't really it doesn't really do much for me. There's not really that much that's happening there, but
depending
you know,
on what translation you're reading, I'll say that much. I quite like Ovid, so I'll stand for Ovid.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, even, you know, like something I think that's even more obvious. Like if you look at the different translations of Catullus, right, you could get a legitimately great poem like a Tulsa Number
I'll
51
say,
and turn it into shit.
I'll say the only good thing Ted Hughes ever did was his version of Metamorphoses by Ovid. But like,
No, I've never read that version.
worth a look, but only if you're feeling charitable.
But anyway, so Bernard Shaw's Pygmalion, it's a similar situation where you have this kind of lifelong bachelor, right, Mr. Higgins, he's some kind of linguist, right? He sees this flower seller in the play, and she has this like very thick, I'm not exactly sure what that kind of English Cockney accent. Okay, so she has this very thick accent. He sees her, he starts like taking down notes, right? He starts becoming obsessed with like thinking like, can I actually turn her into a proper speaker, and also in that way like a proper lady, right? Part of like upper crust society. And he's also a bachelor, but the new element that's introduced here that you don't get in Ovid is he also very much has like a mother complex, right? Where like the first time, like he seems to be like a very sort of serious, gruff man who's like constantly making fun of others, but the second he
seems almost asexual, and I think there's ways to read it where he seems he describes women as blocks of wood in the play.
Yeah, and to him for a long time, that's exactly what it is, right? So his mother is always pestering him, like, "Are you gonna get married or what?" And he essentially says that I haven't found someone to suit me. And
he says, I can't get over you. Like,
yeah, exactly. So, and this starts, having more interplay with Woody Allen in his films, because Woody Allen oftentimes has some sort of like, perhaps you could call it a mother complex in Oedipal, some of his.
But then that's a big theme too, Oedipus and Greek tragedies, isn't it? In a lot of his films. Oh God, we could go on forever talking about this. This is the problem with making a Woody Allen film conversation, isn't it? Suddenly we're talking about Bergman, then we're talking about Greek tragedy, then we're talking about My Fair Lady and Pygmalion. I think that is a really interesting thing, the dynamic between Eliza and Henry Higgins. The fact that he's an elocutionist, he's educating her, he's changing the way she speaks, treating her as a little doll dressing, and what goes from being a very light parlor comedy, a Victorian wager, I'll bet you I can pass off this this flower girl as a lady, turns into something very dark. Also, the moral implications. You realize, what does it mean, like, for kind of a woman like Eliza to sort of gain all this education, one could say, and all these things like etiquette, but not have the means to support herself, or not have the same weight, the same privileges in society that someone like Higgins would have, who takes all this stuff for granted, and it becomes strange because she wants Henry Higgins's respect. She's kind of, but it's a complicated thing with My Fair Lady, and I was spending all day today trying to figure out kind of what the gender politic of it could really be. And there are people who have criticized Woody Allen and his writing of women, and have said that he has a Pygmalion complex. And that kind of in all these films, he's this sort of creepy, pederastic man who like lures in women and makes them so smart and better off, and so and they fall so in love with him, but then he always kind of masochistically ruins the whole thing, and kind of they have to move on with their life, but they've benefited so much from Woody Allen. And as part, I mean, what I certainly resist this interpretation on a gut level, but I'm not sure why, because I think that there is a kind of moral dubiousness in a lot of Woody Allen films where you see kind of the balance of power and sort of stuff. But I think that there's no kind of only the more you go on with films, the more sophisticated his writing of women becomes, the more kind of fully three-dimensional his writing of women becomes. So much so that they make a lot of other films look like crap by comparison, their roles for women and what have you. I mean, even if it represents a very narrow portion of kind of society, kind of, women, upper class women or what have you, or like, yuppies, as you call them. I think, there's still a very complex thing going on with gender and these things, which I think does come out of Pygmalion, but it's not in a kind of the way we tend to think about it.
Yeah,
I don't know what you think.
well, when I think of the play, the reason why I thought the comparison was good on your part is partly because of what I'm about to like flesh out here. So like with with the play itself, I think one of the main reasons why it works so well and what makes it a great play isn't the fact that so like this version of Pygmalion is one where Higgins, he's searching for someone essentially like a woman that he can respect, right? Just like, in Pygmalion in Ovid's poem is looking for a woman that he could finally respect. And he has to find it in a woman that doesn't exist, right? Because for lots of men and their kinds of like, moralizing and, sexual moralizing about women's lives, there is no woman that would work for them, right? There's that part of it. But for Mr. Higgins, he is seeking someone that he could respect. The irony is he needs to do it under the context of this, like, this veneer of like someone that appears ladylike, right? Someone that can speak well, someone that sounds a certain way, someone that dresses a certain way, someone that looks a certain way. But if you actually, read the play from beginning to end, or better yet, upon second reading, you see that Eliza Doolittle has these qualities pretty much from the beginning. She doesn't have the superficial qualities of, she obviously doesn't have money. She obviously doesn't have an upper class dialect, but she has all the personality traits that he as a man is kind of seeking. And he doesn't really recognize that until he puts her through this transformation. And after this transformation, she is now in a position to finally reject him, right?
Yeah, but that's the strange thing, isn't it? He makes her into a version of himself, and then but then the weird thing is, kind of, she says, I could go on and I could become the female version of you. I could teach elocution to people. You get the sense it could almost pick up with Eliza Doolittle stepping into Henry Higgins's role and taking an urchin off the street. But there's, even then, that ending is kind of slightly problematized, because you sense a conflict within Eliza where she's like, is that really what I want to do? Do I really want to become Henry Higgins? And he says, you'll be back. Like, maybe you could do that. Like, that's certainly something that I would respect, but you will be back. You'll come back to me. Sort of a bit like the ending of Manhattan, isn't it? Where kind of he like lingers as she's getting into the elevator, is it? And kind of he asks, will you be back? Are you coming back? And I think who was it? I think it was Dan Schneider's essay where he's talking about, did he write an essay about Manhattan where he talks about this moment where kind of she should escape. She shouldn't come back. She shouldn't go.
I'm not sure if he actually did an essay on Manhattan.
I remember reading someone like, this is how disorganized my mind is.
I did write an essay where I was arguing, so he has something on Woody Allen's, like Woody's Women, but basically in the essay that I did on Manhattan, I'm basically arguing that, near the end, it's maybe
I read,
maybe it could be some sort of like fatherly relationship that he has with the Mariel Hemingway character. But it's very obvious to me that even if she's kind of like pining for him in that moment a bit, I mean, she's about to go abroad and she's about to like fuck like young guys that are actually hot. Right.
Well, that's what he's afraid of, isn't he?
And most likely she is not going to stay with this guy. Like, that's just, I think that's the most realistic way to view it, because I mean, he's powerful, it's true. He's rich, it's true. He has, like, I guess, like some level of wisdom, but at the same time, she's an upper crust girl. She's very young, so she has qualities that many other men are seeking.
In a lot of his films, there are these like teachers or scholars who like sleep with their young students, aren't them? That's a power dynamic that he returns to again and again. The middle-aged, tenured kind of professor sleeping with the adoring kind of doe-eyed student. That's in Husbands and Wives too, I think. And in other films, like, he talked about the temptation to sleep with students, and like he talks about that worshipful kind of like relationship. And knowing that it's kind of there's something unethical about it, or there's or at least or at least that kind of that there's some you're taking advantage of someone's adolescent naivety.
I mean, if we stretch out the Pygmalion frame as much as we can here, and like look at Manhattan for a second, so he is someone like Higgins in the sense that they're both like very flawed characters, right? I'm not so sure that many viewers necessarily get the fact that he's a flawed character, which allows them
to Woody Allen's flawed character.
Yeah. Okay.
I
think many people view the movie and they're like, wow, this is like an example of love persevering, you know, amidst such beautiful romantic imagery, right? I think a lot of people, in fact, interpret the film that way.
Do you think, what about people in the opposite direction, though? People who, because, you know, recently I did rewatch a lot of Woody Allen films kind of over the past couple months with my partner, and every film my partner go, God, he's so unlikable. I really don't like this guy. And what's he doing? What's he thinking? What's he trying? Like, what do you think about that sort of thing too? Because I think it's it's troubling to not see the flaws in those characters.
Yeah.
But what about people of the opposite persuasion? You just only see him as this, you know, top to bottom loathsome character and can't understand why he gets away with what he gets away with, or how people can think he's, you know, one thing.
To the extent that these like Woody Allen stand-in characters are unlikable, I think many of them are, many of them aren't. We're going to talk about Stardust Memories in a bit. And Sandy Bates, you know, he's probably the closest approximation to Woody Allen himself compared to any, you know, Woody Allen character. And if that's in fact the case, well, Sandy Bates is qualitatively just a very, very different creation and person. And you know, he's someone that's disciplined. He's someone that is wise. He's constantly saying worthwhile things in that film. He's constantly, you know, imparting wisdom to others. He's constantly skewering things that deserve to be skewered. And even if Sandy Bates is clearly flawed, he makes up for it in many other ways. You know, when you look
that could be said for a lot of those films, though, Alex. Surely, so I'm not even disagreeing with you, but like, say, just for instance, like in a film like Manhattan, right before he goes off and pursues the young ingenue, he's like reclining in his penthouse and what have you, and he's musing about the reasons to keep living, you know, like the reasons to keep on going, and he starts going, oh, the music of Bach and who else does he say? Satchmo or something like that, and then Cézanne, and like I find that like a genuinely quite moving moment where like, you know, the reason to go on living is because there's all these, you know, great things, you know, like in it reminded me of like that quote from, I think I said this to you in an email too, like Émile Cioran, who often said you know, it would all be worth it, everything kind of any horrible thing that happened in history, it's almost worth it just for the music of Bach. You know, the whole universe was almost brought together for something like Bach to happen. And it's weird to have a moment like that that's so profound, and then to have him kind of just go running after his, you know, the ingenue girl, and kind of like, oh no, don't go off to Europe and kind of like take drugs and fuck other guys and expand your worldview.
I think a lot of artists are like that, though. You know what I mean? A lot of artists would put themselves in these kinds of situations. For the Woody Allen type specifically, his chief advantage, right? Like, you know, Woody Allen has so many well-written flirtation scenes, like with Rain, for example, and Husbands and Wives. You know, it's just like even if it's like between a very old man and this like 19-year-old girl, and it looks kind of disgusting, it's still, you know, brilliantly written scenes. And you know, so the reason, though, why he's capable of that, you could just imagine like Woody Allen growing up, like, you know, as the real life Woody Allen, in his like Brooklyn setting. Now suddenly he's, you know, like 18, 19, he's in the upper crust, he's getting paid to do comedy. He suddenly finds himself in the situation where he needs to start reading books, and for the first time he starts reading books.
This is very interesting to me. As I was reading something recently where it was talking about, you know, this Pygmalion thing, the fact that women in Woody Allen films fall in love with artists and with educated bourgeois people, and they become educated and better people for it, and they start, you know, quoting arts magazines and going to museums and blah blah blah.
But still have to part ways, because what he offers, even if he offers something of value to them, like I think this comes out best in Annie Hall, where you know. Annie Hall, like she may be in many ways like immature. I think at some point she's like, you know, snorting coke or whatever, doing this kind of party life. But essentially, of the two of them, not just intellectually, like perhaps intellectually, she never actually matures to the extent that Woody Allen is. You know, Woody Allen's character is intellectually mature, but she's able to outpace him emotionally, right? She's able to become like a better person, irrespective of, you know, intellectual qualities. And
but I was reading an interview with Woody Allen where he was saying that when he first started dating like women, like they were all much more educated than he was, and they'd be saying like, have you seen the newest opera,
which is why he started getting into the arts. It was literally because of that reason.
Have you read this book by Chekhov? And he would hire private I think that there is an interesting thing you see in it. So it's almost like, you know, he understands the role better for it, of kind of like, you know, the insecurity, like the Eliza Doolittle thing. And there's the sense where in films you see people passing off received wisdom and etiquette kind of with a kind of a worldliness, kind of like, oh, this thing, it's that, you know, when they're talking about architecture or art, kind of people, someone says something clever and everyone nods their heads and goes, yeah, like I think that there's a bit from Hannah and her sisters too, I think, where two of them, the female characters, go with an architect around the city as he points out architecture out to them, and they compete for his affection. They flirt with him as he tries to like give them architectural jargon, and they kind of like try and repeat back what they remembered in college to him. And I think it's brilliant. It's like it's such a subtle way of observing how people engage with one another, but or the way in which, you know, people don't have the same educational backgrounds in real life. People, when people interact, you know, there is always a sort of kind of weird rhetorical slack going on where people kind of nod and look blankly at one another, and sort of I think he really gets the small talk and the dialogical parts of the stuff like dialogue so well, because he gets that thing kind of being in that position where someone well, I think he said himself, someone would ask him if he read a novel, and he'd go, I read comic books, you know, and feeling like embarrassed and out of his league.
Yeah. I mean, like the reason why this is so much closer to Shaw's Pygmalion than Ovid's is, you know, with Ovid, you just have a guy that falls in love with his own creation. With Bernard Shaw, his Higgins is basically someone who, you know, he does try to construct someone that he could, you know, subliminally love, right? I feel like that's a definite subconscious drive throughout the text. But in the midst of doing this, he ends up creating, right, someone that is in a sense co-creating herself, right? Elijah is from the beginning a strong character. She's someone that has depth to her. She's someone that has boundaries and some level of like self-respect,
which is what makes it such a good melodrama. Because of that real emotionality that you feel in scenes coming from the characters, and not just from a whole perspective. They've had an upbringing, they've had a whole progression as a person, which is why the Pygmalion story is so interesting, because it's a sort of interstitial it's a moment of someone's development where they move from one thing to another, and it's awkward and it comes with all sorts of terrifying implications. You know,
and the other side of it, though,
and it's formed through the social relationships one makes, you know, through these men, through these you know, this weird. Sorry, go on.
Well, I mean, like the other side of this though is that like in the act of this like co-creation, both of them are, you know, in the midst of essentially creating each other. Higgins, when he's done, you know, with Elijah in a sense, her personality traits start to like reflect poorly on him, right? He has to now face with his own kind of shortcomings. And you see a lot, the reason why the Pygmalion connection works with Woody is you see a lot of the same thing happening in the Woody Allen characters again and again, where if he does offer something of value, right, to a woman that he's dating, if she ends up leaving him, this is usually a process of he has to deal right, with his own issues, right? He has to bring them to the fore. They are brought to the fore in the process of this co-creation. Annie Hall, again, in many respects, is just a more mature person than Woody by the end of the film. So you wonder, what exactly did he give to her? Was this going to, come about, of its own accord eventually anyway, or what? And you see, more and less of this kind of dynamic in the other films as well. But and Albie Singer from Annie Hall, like, he's especially interesting to me because so many, like, especially like young guys that watch that film, like, teenagers or early 20s, they see themselves so much in Albie Singer, which to me is just kind of crazy. It's like, is this really who you want to see yourself as? Like, it's almost as if like this is an aspirational character, right? And these are like historically, like the kids that I knew growing up that were like really into like Annie Hall and Albie Singer and saw themselves in that film. They were the kids in high school and early college that were constantly like, in fucked up relationships or like fucking things up in other ways, right? And like, that's the thing, like that was the irony, right? They get so attached to this character, not realizing that Woody Allen is kind of skewering him in the same way that they're unable to skewer themselves, right? And eventually, if they have their own kind of Pygmalion situation where they get involved, with a woman that ends up, in some senses being better than they are, that's when they can finally reflect.
Let's get to this thing, which is like the biggest part of the sort of contemporary critique I've seen of Woody Allen. I mean, the thing about Woody Allen is he's definitely not a fashionable filmmaker now.
Yeah,
been in and out of fashion,
especially now.
Has been in and out of fashion for the last, I don't know, 15 years, really. Kind of like and I mean, he's not the sort of filmmaker that, if you mention at parties, I really like Woody Allen, you're going to sound cool and deep.
Yeah.
Like people are going to think, man, what a fucking loser. But the thing is that, and the reason kind of that I thought, it was worth talking to you about Woody Allen was that I think he is underestimated in terms of, like all the new wave American directors who were coming up at the same time. I don't know whether it's because of his comic past. I don't think it is. Or just the sort of the scandals that people tend to always bring up now. But it does seem the case that he's seen as a kind of a problem, sort of, or a problematic, good, but maybe, a sort of a bit off color, whereas someone like Scorsese or someone like even Tarantino are seen as bona fide directors and sort of artists. I mean, at least nowadays. And I think that is a tricky one to sort of deal with when kind of he is just seen as kind of he is seen, I think, as a sexist and all this other stuff. And people always bring up this thing about his films of the stereotype now, although people used to use it much more kind of 7-8 years ago, manic pixie dream girl. That kind of like, you have all these quite chauvinistic, this is basically a sort of a male fantasy. It's the bluntest way I could put it. That kind of this is all very indulgent, kind of self-centered, kind of airing out of his neuroses about women and whatever, and kind of he returns to it again and again and again.
But they're better than he is, though, in so many of these films. Like, I feel like that has to be wrestled with in some way. Those characters are
dream girls,
they're better people oftentimes, not always. They're more mature oftentimes, not always. And to the extent that he has like completely broken characters like Dory, they reflect his own issues. But so when we say like that he's out of fashion, I think one of the reasons why he would be out of fashion is he does deal with a certain kind of male sexuality, right?
And macho. Even if he is a kind of short kind of they are quite macho films. He does play quite the macho characters, like all that sort of stuff.
Yeah,
you think that's threatening in a way to kind of current sensibilities, kind of
like, this is what I'm getting at. This is what I'm getting at. So it's basically, it's like so first of all, like in contemporary society, like male sexuality and like the depth of male sexuality, and the whole idea that males could like sit around and think about their sexualities and think about their sex lives and sort of, you know, meditate on their, it could be pathologies, it could be neuroses, it could be, you know, healthy relationships. Like that's considered taboo. You as a man should not have any depth of sexuality, right? Only the women are allowed to have depth. Like they're turning, you know, women once again into noble savages, right? And they have this like mysterious sexuality, and we ought to celebrate and we ought to talk about it. But
even something like Stardust Memories is pointed to with Charlotte Rampling's role as kind of like she's the crazy, unattainable, you know, she's like Medea or something like that. Do you know what I mean? And you kind of go, oh, well, yeah, but that's kind of the point. But it does seem kind of, it certainly seems opposed to the kind of political correctness we see now. And definitely we do see a lot of politics, I think, informing the way that critical consensus is built, kind of at least on these aggregated websites and what have you, and sort of all that kind of thing. And it could just be that instead of cribbing one another all the time, these critics generally just tend to have the same cliched thoughts about films and just follow the what's in the air at the moment. Like, oh, this guy seems to be swinging his dick a bit, kind of like he seems to kind of like being on the camera. He likes kind of like putting himself at the center of the stories with kind of like, and making his making them about him getting with these beautiful actresses who are always crazy. Like it feels like it must be his fantasy, right? I mean, this you know,
it's also real though. Like it's also real in the sense that, like, you know, when Woody Allen was growing up, like in Brooklyn or whatever, like he recognized that the way into getting these, like, you know, supermodels or whatever, or actresses that he's interested in, you know, it's not going to come through his like great fucking looks, right? It's not going to come from his like overwhelming height, right? Me being 5'8" myself, right? I'm always kind of like shocked at seeing like various subreddits and things where men are like really obsessed with their own heights. And it's actually galling to lots of people, and to women especially, that you could have a guy like Woody Allen who the only thing that he has going for him is he has tons and tons of like verbal ability, let's say, right? And he has and also, you know, he happens to be like rich and talented, right? Which is like another kind of equalizer, right? But he's not, you know, great looking. He looks, you know, dorky and dopey, and he looks like a nerd. He's short. He is actually surprisingly though like very athletic. That's one of the things that people don't know about him. But anyway, that's like very galling, right?
The musician.
Like not only, and also just like, you know, he was like a huge like handball player. Like he was actually truly athletic and strong, although he doesn't look like it. Basketball player, right? It's stuff that you don't expect, but you know, it's galling because, like, on the one hand, men aren't supposed to have a deep sexuality, especially one that they publicly discuss, right? That's considered taboo. And then on the other hand,
but like just like an affluent white male upper middle, you know, bourgeois sex, that's the thing. You know, if he was like a gay guy or something like that, like, and that's just the thing with something like Pygmalion. I was watching a film of a version of Pygmalion recently with Peter O'Toole, and I was watching it with my partner, and we were just like, and there was a moment where Colonel Pickering,
that's a 1963 film.
I think it was made for like Canadian television or something like this. It's a shaky film because Eliza Doolittle's Cockney accent is fucking terrible, but Peter O'Toole is great. But I was watching it, and Colonel Pickering mentioned something that he was mentioned very offhandedly, that he had been living with Henry Higgins for like the best part of a year now. And like I just turned to like a Nick and said, that's a bit odd, isn't it?
Yeah.
And like and the fact, and they go like, hang on a bit, he's called women lumps of wood. He's never had a proper sort of relationship, or like he's never had one that's lasted. He like in a way, he is either, you could read him as an asexual character or as some sort of repressed Victorian homosexual or something like that. But just that kind of, you know, we can. It's a bit different, sort of his sort of reptilian, kind of quite cold or acerbic character, compared to someone like Woody Allen, who's like more kind of like wisecracking, more kind of like loud, kind of like a sort of a loud kind of guy who would kind of, you know, like sort of, you know, somebody who could be the life of a dinner party maybe, or be just like absolutely ruin the dinner party.
Well, let's bring some of these like problems, and let's bring feminism into, like, let's bring all that into the fore. Like maybe we could systematically go through some of these films. We said we were going to discuss in some depth, like Husbands and Wives, Stardust Memories, Midnight in Paris, and what was the last one that we were going to do? Another Woman. Sure. I mean, like, I think you said that Husbands and Wives is maybe your favorite Woody film. It's definitely one of my favorites, and I think it's one of his best.
Intellectually, Stardust Memories is probably, it's got to be up there. It's a really great one. But like, we're talking about Husbands and Wives, aren't we? Yeah, Husbands and Wives was just such a visceral film, and like afterwards, I was just like, wow. You know, I didn't even know he had it in him to make a film like that, and it's just really, really good. And I don't know, like, where do you want to get started off talking about this film?
I mean, maybe you could start like with the opening scene, right? So you have Mia Farrow. Mia Farrow's character is Judy, and Gabe is the Woody Allen character. So they're in their apartment, and they're being visited by their friends Sally and what's the guy's name? It's Sally and Jack, right? And so Jack and Sally are they just like show up, and they're like, guess what, guys? We're about to get a divorce. This creates this like total meltdown, right? Where, well, first of all, Gabe, the Woody Allen character, he's just, you know, he's shocked by this, but he's like, you know, he's waiting to listen to them speak. He's understanding what they're saying.
Bemused by it as well.
Yeah. Or at least, you know, he's trying to understand in some way. Whereas Judy, she just completely breaks down.
She takes it personally. Yeah.
Not only does she take it personally, but one thing I didn't recognize before, like, I mean, I've watched the film many times at this point, but like, so she's a very like toxic and very kind of, I'm not sure if I'd call her an evil character, but she's a very bad person throughout the film, right? And she's very manipulative. She, you know, the idea is that she's passive aggressive, her ex-husband says, and she always gets what she wants.
I think that's a way into her character that we're given.
Yeah.
Like, I think there is on certain viewings, I've kind of gone kind of like, wow, what is her fucking deal? What does she want? And go like, yeah, she is kind of like, but I don't know, actually. I think, you know,
she does make correct critiques.
You could argue that she might be kind of, she might have cleaner hands than most of the characters, but I think there is a rationale for like, saying that she is a passive aggressive manipulative person who wants to play the victim, but is actually, you know, kind of quite a toxic presence.
Yeah, and I mean, in that opening scene, like, I think it's kind of telling how from the very beginning she turns this outside event, right? This is a thing that happens to her friends. They're the ones who are going through this breakup. And she turns that entire experience into something that's all about herself. All the attention you start noticing near the end of the scene, it drifts not from these characters are saying about their marriage breaking apart. It drifts to Judy and her responses. It drifts to people in that room trying to make her feel better. Right, and this is like a little.
Although again, like, I'm not to play devil's advocate, but the divorce does tend to be much more. I mean, they are trying to play it coolly that they're getting, you know, oh, we're taking a break, but it is actually much more damaging to kind of like themselves and everyone around them. Then they let on. So maybe she has a right to kind of feel a bit. But again, I don't know. I'm just saying, there's an ambiguity with all of the actions of the people in here. You know, you can look at the guy who starts dating the young buff hard body girl who believes in astrology. And
Sam,
that's fucked up, man. That whole thing is fucked up. I watched it one night with my partner, and he was watching it through his fingers. Like that whole thing, like you
mean in the scene where, you know, he has this like final confrontation with Sam, and he's like dragging her to the
whole
car.
the whole night, dragging her from house to house, and everyone screaming at one another.
It's both very funny, and it's also sad at the same time, and it's also, you know, kind of scary because he seems on the verge of like literally just like, you know, breaking her face, right? So there's a lot.
And Woody Allen's has this Pygmalion thing going on too with the young girl. There's another thing that happened, like and that's really dubious and fucked up as well. And like,
so you mean his student Rain?
Rain, oh yeah,
Rain is the name of
like,
his student.
Where he's kind of like toying with whether to kind of hook up with it, and basically subtly flirting with the whole thing there, and it's very grim and kind of well, and so kind of like everyone is in a kind of a much bleaker situation than they're making out when they greet each other at the door, going, "Hi, oh, wine, what are we gonna go see tonight?" This kind of world of middle class etiquette and middle class morality. That's a big theme of Pygmalion. Mr. Doolittle says, "Oh, I'm trapped by middle class morality."
Yeah, it's a common phrase in that text.
Yeah, and that's what happens in sort of husbands and wives. Kind of what's the morality of the middle class? You kind of don't. It's in a way to kind of like the sort of the. I don't know. I don't want to get into like Hegelianism or anything like that. But it's almost like you're supposed to feel okay with anything. No, it's not a divorce. It's a trial separation. We're seeing other people, like
is that really middle class though? That strikes me as very, very upper class concern. You know what I mean? Like people that have the luxury to
more. Yeah, well, yeah, it does kind of represent that, but I think it's more and more commonly, broadly, sort of it representative of a kind of attitude of sexual morality as well. You see it more and more. Like people almost feel ashamed nowadays if they're not if they're not kinky or they're not sexual or they're not kind of if they turn down the threesome. As Zizek puts it, like you almost don't feel like you can not participate. You feel almost like I want to be a boring person who reads books in my middle class world. Why do I have to like spice things up with my eyes wide shut other life? Why can't I be kind of this thing that we're, and like learning to be okay and to be like to settle with that, and like the sort of how that's kind of brought along with the theme of compromise as well. And that this whole like, are you chasing after a fantasy? Are you chasing after something you just think you want? And there's that phrase as well from Pygmalion. I think Henry Higgins says it. If we really knew what we wanted, would we really even want it? Like or if we knew what we were doing, why would we ever fucking do it? It's kind of that thing there, kind of like people try and sort of chase after what they think they want, or they kind of feel like they have to do that. Like oh, you're seeing other people, now I have to go see other people. You're moving on with my life. I have to do the things that everyone sees I'm moving on with my life, even though you're not okay and you haven't moved on. This kind of that weirdness thing there. You're kind of like, what is the question? It's a double bind in a way. Like, is it quote unquote middle class morality? I don't know, and certainly what one would call middle class morality is very different from the world of Pygmalion to the way that it is in Husbands and Wives, and even the way it is now. I think that sort of thing shifts, but it's interesting and it feels real. I think it feels really three-dimensional and really like kind of the sort of I mean, I haven't always had amazing relationships, so that I haven't always been unselfish in love and kind of that sort of thing too. And I think it gets right the ways in which kind of those dynamics play, the way in which people insecurities bounce off of one another in a social context too, in the context of class and the context of kind of if you're dating someone who's not if you're middle class and you date someone who's not middle class, or someone who's much even richer than you, like what happens there? Like someone who's older than you, someone who it's like it's complicated, and it involves a lot of masks and a lot of what have you, a lot of role playing and kind of saying the right things.
You mentioned earlier in our notes about like framing, so there's like a couple of things I want to mention. So like, first of all, in terms of specific, like, so in Husbands and Wives, it's shot through like mostly like a handheld camera, so it's very kind of jagged, right? That opening scene where the four friends are with each other, and Jack and Sally announce their divorce. It's kind of like the camera is sort of like getting in behind some of the characters. It's exactly. Everything feels like very kind of immersive, and also kind of like jagged, shaky. And throughout the film, there's this kind of like it's like a conceit, right, where this is supposed to be like a documentary, right? I'm not sure if you remember that portion of the film, but the characters are basically
Giving interviews.
being interviewed by somebody that we never see.
Yeah.
The guy asks like some kind of barbed questions at times about their personalities, their sexuality, why they behave
Open
the way that they're
questions.
behaving, and just like what do you think about this faux documentary aspect of it? Because like what is the implication that you have like someone that wants to interview essentially these four random people about their relationships? Because to me, it's like there's like two levels of irony here. We have the fact that like just generally speaking, most people would not be interested in some generic person's sex life, right? You wouldn't have that happen ordinarily, but in this
You'd be
case,
surprised.
well, I mean, sometimes, but like specifically for the subject of a documentary, that generally doesn't happen unless there's like a reason for
nowadays, especially on British TV, a lot of gimmick documentaries are like this. Actually, I mean, they
really?
don't tend to be about characters from that kind of world of yuppie world. They're usually more about kind of working people or what have you, but there usually is that sort of conceit of kind of real people, real whatever.
Or let's say like it wouldn't happen in like, what is this, like 1992? Like it probably wouldn't happen in 1992, right? But it happens here, and part of the reason why it happens here obviously is these four characters, they are and this is where like that conceit starts to turn into like really what the reality is. These four characters, they are unique cases because they've been crafted as like subtle, nuanced characters by the director and the writer, who is Woody Allen, right? They've been made into art, and therefore they are considered valuable enough to ask questions about, right? Because you get this film for only about, it's a little over 90 minutes, but you get a ton of character arcs, you get a ton of changes, and you get tons of psychological revelations, right? This is the reason why you could have this conceit and you could make it work in this context, even if you are operating under multiple levels of irony there. So that's kind of like the frame for the film, and just always keeping in mind this like handheld camera portion to it. Like very oftentimes, like you mentioned also in your notes, that
but no one acknowledges the camera outside of the interviews. That's the interesting thing, that they're not treated as so no one like turns and goes, why are the film camera like so it's almost as if we kind of waver back and forward between that in a way, but it never takes one by surprise. That's the interesting thing. I think the sort of it's basically just a really good, really eloquent way to get that immersiveness, but that directness as well, where just the characters speak directly to us, and then events follow naturally so something happens and then we see it. It doesn't feel like a contrivance. Things just follow on as a sequence, like a mockumentary would. But it doesn't parade itself or try to to contrive a kind of documentary thing with where like Blair Witch or something like that, like or one of these other mockumentaries. The commentary and the interviews, as it were, sort of bookend certain segments. They sort of divide them up into sort of different parts of the narrative, I think, like or chapters. But I was never like watching it consciously, kind of like thinking of it as a documentary, or even like
it's a light element to it. It's a light element, but I mean, it exists, right? And you always have to sort of ask yourself, well, why is it here? What is it doing, right? And my answer is the answer that I gave. You also mentioned like the individual framings of characters, right, by the camera, and I think this film especially does this really well, where you get tons of shots where you have two characters speaking, but the camera only stays, for example, you mentioned rain earlier, like early on when Woody Allen, I believe he's a professor at Columbia in the movie, he has this like 19 or 20-year-old student named Rain, and like early on, like when he like confronts her, let's call it, about the story that she wrote, and he's saying how good it is, right, how interesting he found it. The camera does not show his face, right? It just stays on her to sort of show you what her responses are, what she's doing with this information. You get the sense from the very beginning that she sort of did this hoping she would get this kind of response. Like you could tell that she's not only extremely happy getting this response from Gabe, but she's also trying to keep it a secret, right? She's trying to keep some of that flirtation alive. And then they decide to go take a walk together. And the whole, well, not the whole time, but for much of the time, the camera stays on her, right? And I mean, she's I forget the name of the actress that plays her, but she's a great actress in this film, right? This I think it's this gets carried off very well.
I think it's interesting. His framing of people's faces, but also of there's just the framing and the blocking of actors themselves, their bodies, their movements, their gestures is really sophisticated in Woody Allen's films when he's at his best. He knows exactly what details to commit, and so that's often the sort of subtext of people's body language as well. Not a kind of, I mean, the way that people will say one thing but maybe convey something entirely else in their posture or kind of their hand movements, or even I think he tries to convey this as much as he can in his films, even when in Annie Hall, like where they're talking and then subtitles for a different conversation play out underneath, or people, or their inner thoughts anyway, their internal commentary. And you get that as well in Hannah and Her Sisters, where kind of you see events play out and people retrospectively talk over them, going, "Oh God, I was trying to act like I was having a nice time, but really that evening was shit." And that's a really great part of the way that he is able to zero in on actors' performances and get them to convey those subtleties, like you're talking about.
Do you remember that part in Husbands and Wives where Rain and Gabe are in the taxi cab trying to find the novel that she lost, right? So he wrote a novel, she lost it, and so she's sitting in the car and she's like,
first he's like, you lost it. No, don't tell me. And then he, like he's still talking to her like in that sort of gentle kind of like voice, and then he kind of like, by the end, he's like pulling his hair and kind of, I can't believe you've done this.
And in the cab, they're just like, she starts saying like, there's something so Freudian about this, right? Where, maybe I was threatened by your book, right? And she starts actually giving off the same kind of critiques that we alluded to earlier, right? Those feminist critiques where, she's saying stuff to him like, these guys are just walking around, like the way that you're describing women and the way you're describing these relationships, isn't it so kind of like retrograde? Isn't it, isn't this, isn't it that? And at some point, like, so on the one hand, like the reason why I was calling all this stuff like, male sexuality isn't taken seriously. It's almost stigmatized in a sense. Like you see in that scene, the reality of that kind of assessment play out, because as she's criticizing him and specifically his novel, right, which is the thing that he's most concerned about, she seems to be just kind of like fishing for a reaction, because at some point when she gets like in the heat of these critiques, he's like essentially like why should I care about what some 20-year-old twit is telling me, is the way that he calls her. And as he says that, you see her face and she's kind of like turning away from him, so he can't fully see, but we directly see what she's doing with her face. And she smiles a lot when he calls her a 20-year-old twit, because she's kind of like looking for this kind of response. She's trying to continue turning this into a potential flirtation scene, maybe have some kind of affair with this guy. And he's someone that's taking his book and his art and his sexuality seriously. She is responding to this, as even if she's like a too young of a girl to truly understand what's going on, she understands it enough to get more or less what she wants out of this interaction. And, I think that gets very much underplayed. Like, it's very subtle. Like all it is like they're talking and the camera just stays on her. Right. And she's turning away. Right.
It's one of the best moments of the film.
Yeah.
I mean, the big arguments, the big confrontations are always kind of the high point of those melodramas. But I think what other films are on the list though? Because we're going to be in danger of dwelling.
Well, let me just like return just slightly to Judy, right? So I said Judy is like the most toxic character. I think she is, but that's not to say that she's a two-dimensional character. She's not. In fact, very like all characters in this film are definitely flawed.
She seems emotionally needy. I mean, that seems.
I mean, yeah, she is of course she's all that. She's also kind of like an emotional vampire in many ways, but many of the critiques that she lobs against Gabe, they are correct, right? When Gabe says, when people do this, like, bullshit, like, this like a naive anti-natalist argument, like, why would you bring children into this world, blah, blah, blah. When it's, that's never a good argument. I think there's plenty of arguments why someone, especially certain kinds of people, shouldn't have kids, but that's rarely a good argument. And when Gabe like brings this up, she's like, oh, that's bullshit, right? You're just hiding behind this like highfalutin philosophy, which is absolutely true. And it made me think upon, I rewatched it a couple nights ago. Imagine Rain, right, decides to like not only have a relationship with this guy. Imagine that she plays like this total like male fantasy. Not to say this is my male fantasy, but this is like a generic male fantasy of I'm gonna be the pretty young beautiful housewife, and I'm gonna fucking suck you in any kind of combination that you want, and I'm just gonna stay home, read the books that you send me to read, write whenever I can write stories and regale you with my talents, and pop out baby after baby after baby. I get the sense Gabe would have agreed to that arrangement, right? Like a 20-year-old girl, he's already like almost 50. He probably would have said yes, whereas he did not say yes to Judy. I think like a lot of the critiques that she makes of some of the characters in the films, they are spot on. It's also true that these critiques are just as applicable to her. Therefore, she is hypocritical in many regards. I mean, she flips out in the first scene about the breakup of Jack and Sally because she herself admits later on in the movie that, she herself is scared of her own marriage breaking apart, which is why she had that kind of hysterical response. And just a couple other things before we move on to the next film. I think it's also really like one of the best scenes in the film is when Rain's parents, during like Rain's birthday party, I think that's when she turns 20 or 21. I forget the age that she turns, but you get very briefly like a 5-10 second interaction between Rain's parents. They're alone. They kiss each other. They like, I think they toast glasses. I think they're drinking champagne.
They're creepy.
Oh, I disagree. I think they are the only characters in the film that so clearly love each other and so clearly seem to have a mature relationship. The only characters, and you get only 10 seconds of that.
I wouldn't let my daughter hang around with Woody Allen. I don't, and that's not because of the rumors. Like, just like if you're bringing all the guys back home,
but they also love him though. They're like, oh, we love your work. We love that you're her professor. But maybe you could
we love your work. Sleep with our daughter.
Maybe in some way, I don't know. Maybe they're not the best parents. I mean, who knows? But specifically about the dynamics of their own relationship, like I think it's so wonderful.
They seem happy. They seem happy.
But you only get like 10 seconds of that genuine interaction where they just look at each other and they're like, my God,
they name their child after Rilke.
Yeah,
what? It's like the bourgeois dream, kind of like
but it's also genuine between them. I mean, again, it's only 10 seconds, but they look at each other and they're like, God, like it's been 30 years, but they have such a loving look. And nobody else in the film has, everybody else has some sort of toxic kind of dynamic. I think the funniest scene in the movie is when like Rain is like standing outside and suddenly the psychiatrist that she ends up like seeing, right, her therapist, essentially she ends up like sleeping with, and he's like confronting her because he wants to find out why aren't they dating anymore. And you see this like old guy just like yelling at her and you're like, what the fuck? But then the camera, after like like a half minute of this, you don't even see Woody. Then the camera suddenly pans to Woody, and you see these two old ass guys like staring at each other, and the one thing in common, the common denominator, is this girl that's like standing between them, that got them in the situation, that was into one, slept with her therapist, clearly wants to sleep with this other guy. And in a typical kind of like feminist reading, they would view this as like, oh, they're grooming this little innocent girl, when the most realistic reading, when you see that scene, is, wow, she's the only one with any kind of power here, and these two look so pathetic, right? And it's very obvious, like, where Woody stands there as the artist, like as the overvoice in the film. He's clearly critical of Gabe, and he's critical of the therapist, and he's critical of this girl, despite the fact that he imbues her with all this power, right? And like in terms of like any kind of like straitjacket feminist narrative, I mean, you can't do that. It's clear that she's the only one with power in that scenario. Like, look at these two old guys almost coming to blows over this like 20-year-old twit. It's just crazy. But anyway.
Wow, you're a real misogynist there, Alex.
Yeah, I definitely have misogynistic tendencies when I talk about Woody Allen's films.
Well, I don't know. I don't think she is a twit, and I think like I'm just quoting him. She's messing around with older men, but I think it's I think that the whole thing that's interesting about those sort of films that Woody Allen makes is the sort of the moral ambiguity. And the fact that kind of like everyone's kind of culpable in all of this, because of the hypocrisy that goes on all around, and all the kind of the weird signaling everyone does to one another, kind of like the weirdness of flirtation as well, and like the social dynamics of that. But but we should move on to another Woody Allen film, man.
Yeah, well, just another thing on Rain. I mean, she's definitely she's probably my favorite Woody Allen character, right? Because I mean, there is like so much
great lines.
Yeah, she's got great lines. There's so much to her. She probably does have actual depth. It seems like she does have some level of writing talent, some level of like critical acumen. It's always like, wishy-washy as to whether or not the artists within these films are actually talented, or whether Woody is just making fun of them. I think usually, or oftentimes at least, he is making fun of them. But Rain is, she's on the one hand, like, yes, she is like presented as like a naive 20-year-old, but she's also presented as someone that's powerful, alluring, perhaps even brilliant in some ways. And I think, any kind of like the reason why like I so push back against feminism is, and its attempts to like straitjacket so much. You
mean like feminist criticism, or like
feminist criticism, or like a lot of like feminist ideology? Like, there's this kind of overcompensation for years and years of abuse by the hands of men and patriarchal, arrangements, to the point that right now women and feminists are so willing to paper over actual depth in various characters, whether it's like Marion and another woman, or whether it's Rain in this film. They want to paper over all those realities. They want to paper over the power that so many of these women in fact have, and by doing that, you're kind of like you're taking a lot away from women. And I don't think a lot of people get that. People don't get that whether you take stuff away from women or whether you worship women, both of those actions are, they're getting away from what people are, right? Because any kind of deification means that you're not able to treat people with any kind of real human level respect, right? So anyway, we can move on to these other films.
I personally say that I support feminism insofar as that I think there are problems that are specific to women, like specific political problems.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
What have you. Like and obviously there are all kinds of strains of pop ideology, pop philosophy, pop feminism, pop politics that really
I'm kind of focusing more on that, right? And a lot of like more kind of like mainstream narratives. It's not obviously that I'm against like the concept of feminism. Like, I want women to
it's so easy, especially on YouTube, to just be like lumped in with kind of the usual kind of anti-feminist rhetoric that goes on, and it's like that stuff's just as, if not more, toxic. And I think there's many arguments one can make that Woody Allen's filmography is, for the most part, largely quite feminist, or
Yeah, I agree,
lends
100%.
itself to a sophisticated feminist
Yes.
vernacular.
Yes.
In the sense that women are portrayed as real three-dimensional people with their, normal people with their everyday lives, kind of like, even if they do come from like again the upper crust, or they're yuppies in these films, kind of like I think there is a quote from him saying that kind of, you can say a lot of things about me, but you can't say that I don't know how to write women.
Yeah,
so
of course.
Women might not always be angels or or what have you, like in his films, but they're still really good characters, and that kind of makes them sort of, that means you can't have a sort of a shitty kind of like surface level reading of that thing in terms of the gender relationships it portrays. Like, just like I don't think you could say that, obviously Pygmalion reflects all kinds of attitudes at the time that it was written, which don't track very well kind of now, and but it, it's, I wouldn't call it a sexist play, and I don't think I don't think it's a sexist text, and I don't think the characters in that are sexist stereotypes, even if they're playing with certain kind of things that are taken from like the actual like Cockney slang, like for instance in the fact in England class is very well represented in terms of elocution and in terms of kind of how people speak and pronounce the Queen's English. Whereas in America it's in New York it's maybe something much more subtle, like I don't know.
Yeah,
but that goes for gender too, as well as like accent. It's all that's played out really well.
I mean, I definitely agree with that. Like, we could move into like another woman, 1987 film by Woody Allen starring Jenna Rowland. And yeah, like I mean, definitely agreed that he writes very feminist characters, right? And this is the kind of feminism that I would support, right? To the extent that there's like these feminist critics of Woody Allen's work, a lot of it is exactly that kind of idiotic pop feminism that you alluded to. I mean,
a lot of the curatorial feminism we see now is like representation, isn't it? It's kind of like more women artists, or just more women in art. And it's like in the one sense it's a kind of fairly logical approach to what seems like the displacement of women from the arts. But on the other hand, like we've talked about in other videos too, like it's equality of outcome, right? More women doesn't mean more good art. It just means more women. And like it could mean more bad art too. It could mean it means all sorts of different things. And the way that plays into selection processes too. I mean, you talked about the way in which male sexuality is kind of off the table nowadays. I think it's more the case that kind of sort of the idea of sort of male narratives are kind of seen as a bit kind of the man's side of the story. We hear these kind of, and I don't know how exaggerated these reports are, but there are all sorts of chatter and gossip about how in competitions for arts prizes or what have you, men are passed over for kind of women artists or more slightly more exotic artists. They come from the authentic ghetto, their story, they're treated very much like that, kind of like exotic, beautiful, interesting people, instead of kind of people who have something creative they want to do. And I think on that level, that kind of liberal politic of kind of like feminism, where it's like, just get rid of all the issues and make it just about just how many women are in the room at one time, or is very, I think, totally kind of shit neoliberalism, shit kind of like band-aid capitalism.
So what do you think of another woman?
Another woman. That's the film, isn't it? Where the woman is writing her novel, and she starts to hear through the ventilation system the psychoanalyst next door talking to his patient.
It's not a novel; it's some kind of paper, some kind of book related to philosophy. I don't think it's a novel, though.
It's her treatise.
She's a philosopher.
She's like she's a high achieving philosopher. That's right.
Yeah.
And she was trained. Her ex-lover was her philosophical teacher, was it? He was kind of her Henry Higgins, even though she's a smart, sophisticated woman in her own right from the upper middle class. Or is she? She comes from she is. She is from a quite
it seems that it's somewhat upper class. Yeah, like you see her like visiting, like in her imagination, like the old farmhouse. that kind of thing. It seems like her father,
You have the
her
fail
father,
son,
yeah, her father is a historian who, you know, he has the same kind of shortcomings as she does, like emotionally speaking. Near the end of the film, he says something like, you know, I've achieved some level of renown, but I feel like I was not hard enough on myself, right? In the sense that I did not ask enough of myself, emotionally speaking, perhaps in terms of relationships. And you
it,
also get the sense that, you know, perhaps like some of these people's concerns, like even if like this father historian is supposed to be very kind of you know, fixated on what he's able to produce, it's probably not all that worthwhile, to be honest. I mean, at any given time, you have, you know, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, or perhaps even more historians working on all kinds of problems.
yeah.
Not all of it is really going to matter, you know, within a century. So, you know, some of the critique seems to be lobbed a little bit in that direction as well.
You mean sort of people writing philosophical treatises?
I mean, perhaps like the, you know, part of the critique is like she's been too concerned with her work and not with other parts of her life. You know, that is like a recurring theme
Well,
in the
I don't
film.
know. I don't know if it's about the vaingloriousness of writing philosophical treatises. I mean, there's a
No,
sense in
it's
which
not.
she
Yeah,
does. There's a
it's not
sense in
mostly
which she
that.
does. There's a sense in which she does displace maybe other parts of her life with her
Yeah.
work, and that just seemed to be, you know, this kind of theme. I mean, as a film, it's interesting. I mean, there are kind of Woody Allen films where you get these sort of anti-natalist sentiments or sort of slightly pessimistic themes, but this stands out in its sort of as a kind of elegiac quality. I mean, it's about a woman who is essentially having to accept her death. Maybe in a certain sense, it touches upon Bergman in that way and sort of connects back to a film like Interiors, which is a film I'm kind of half
Well,
and half of.
it's somewhat based on Wild Strawberries directly. Like from the beginning, like you
Yeah.
have that ticking clock intro, the journey into like, you know, your like it's very much modeled after Wild Strawberries, except that
Mm-hmm.
the strategies that the two films take are a little different. Like in Wild Strawberries, the Bergman film, you have like Isaac, you know, he's traveling to get this honorary degree, and he's being told all these things about his life, about his interactions, about his past, that you as the audience, like you sort of believe at the beginning, you see his like gruffness a little bit, but as the film goes on, he's clearly not what he's being accused of. He's much more caring and even sentimental and even romantic. At the very end of the film, he has a very kind of healthy, even if it seems on the surface gruff interaction with his maid. They seem to really like and perhaps even love one another, you know, which is kind of like unexpected given how the film began. Whereas with Marion, I think uh, it's the opposite tack, at least in the sense that she's starting out not truly understanding what her shortcomings are and the things that other people say about her. Some of them do seem to be on the money. Some other accusations that are lobbed against her, you don't truly know whether or not they're true. Like she, for example, like runs into her previous best friend Claire, and it's obvious that Claire and her husband, or rather Claire specifically, the husband doesn't really know who this woman is, but Claire doesn't want to like interact with her. She doesn't want to go get a drink. She doesn't want to catch up, but she's kind of like forced into it. And by the end of the night, she's, you know, Claire is accusing Marion of like breaking up some relationship that she had earlier on by flirting subconsciously with some guy that Claire was interested in. And given what you get to know about Marion's character, Marion's past, it's not, you know, you wouldn't put it past her to do that, but it's also this like poetic tension where you can't say for certainty that this is the way that she behaved, right? You have to just go on your own instinct based on the evidence that's slowly unfolding before you in the film.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's like what would you say that her shortcomings were in the film, these things that she neglects?
Uh, she seems to
Marion.
not, she seems, for example, to not really care too much about cultivating a relationship with her brother, right? This could be, you know, for different reasons. Like I'm sure there are some illegitimate resentments that her brother Paul has towards Marion, in the sense that she was favored. It's not really her fault that she was favored by her father, right? But then another level, like you do get the sense that she was kind of like ignoring trying to cultivate any sort of relationship when she runs into Paul's wife. They're about to like get a divorce. It's very obvious that she knows absolutely nothing about his wife. She's never tried to get to know her in any kind of way. She has wanted, it seems, for a very long time to have children, and the reason why she has an abortion early on in her relationship with that kind of philosopher, mentor slash guru, whoever he was to her. She says that she's worried about the career, but by the time that she turns 50, she more or less admits that she's afraid of the kind of passions and feelings that having a child would stir within her. Right. And like it's kind of sad to like live 50 years saying that you're not wanting children for all the wrong reasons, while in fact secretly harboring the desire and merely being frightened of the emotional consequences, which are not really the kind of consequences that you should be thinking about when it comes to kids, right? So
it's a very natural thing to fit. I mean, like what I came away with, I mean, like maybe I have a lot of compassion for these characters in Woody Allen films. I mean, like especially her. I mean, I would never have to personally make that choice about whether to keep a child, like, of a person I don't know if I'm in love with or not, or kind of like what, but to imagine those things and see the way they're represented, it obviously she's left with the problem. The viewer is left with the problem that at the end of her life she is kind of alone, and the people who should be kind of like close to her or should be like invested, they're at a distance, and we're left with the problem of kind of how this can kind of happen, kind of how we can get this kind of like what is basically a sort of tragic ending, when kind of the decisions she made, she kind of made of her own kind of free will and kind of for very kind of rational, humane decisions. She chooses independence. She chooses to have power over herself and not be tied to anybody. But at the end, it means that when she gets in trouble, she's on her own. And that's what we all have to face. That's the choice that we all have to face in society, with our families, with our loved ones, with the people just we live with. Like how much do you involve yourself kind of in how much do you participate, in a certain way. When you do love someone, you give up a certain kind of amount of freedom, that whole kind of romantic idea of love. You fall in love with someone, kind of you would die without them. They can't kind of be replaceable, kind of like, and it's not always something that's calculable. Like, for instance, I mean, in a way my relationship is kind of like a romantic thing like that. It was love at first sight and we fell in love, and frightening consequences come with that. You suddenly you lose the right to be selfish in a certain way. You lose the right to kind of you have to suddenly put up these other person's needs in front of others, to inconvenience yourself. You become like a prisoner in love, like a slave to love. And the problem here, and the sort of the dilemma we're faced with in film, is she chooses independence. She chooses kind of that distance, and kind of she ends up on her own. It's the difference between going into the woods at night with your friends. It's very different from going into the woods at night alone. And this is what happened. I mean, this is very existential in a way, and I think this is why kind of Bergman is the key, is the touchstone here, and it's a touchstone for a lot of Woody Allen stuff. I think I read somewhere once someone described him as a mix of Bergman and the Marx Brothers, or existentialism and Jewish humor comedy. That's a neat way of putting it. It's a neat formula for what Woody Allen is. But there is that kind of existential vein where it's like, why is there something instead of nothing? Why are we here? Why do kind of bad things happen? And why is it that when we make all when we make our own choices and whatever, bad shit can fucking happen to us? It's quite religious in a way, quite Christian, kind of quite like Job or something like that. Quite Bergman-esque in the way that he does his sort of pessimistic, atheistic religious dramas. And I think that's what Woody Allen is pulling from with a film like this.
Yeah,
it's a great powerful film of kind of like the emotions that come through. And although it is very depressing as a consequence of that, because those emotions are sad and they're regretful and they're bleak.
Well, just a couple comments on this idea of the aloneness. This gets extrapolated in the film to like even like, you know, not necessarily romantic scenarios where at some point, like Marion's husband, you know, they're having this like, I forget exactly what the context was, like what party it was, but they're having a party at his house. All these like colleagues are there, like all the, you know, it could be doctors or whatever, you know, people at a college, like whatever it might be. And suddenly his ex-wife shows up with like some boxes that she's returning. And she's like, you know, you could say something. I'm not a ghost, right? Some of these other people used to be my friends as well, right? And it just kind of struck me like, well, why exactly would these former friends of her, like, why did they turn their backs on her, right? Because it seems like in the context of their relationship, she was not the one at fault. He was the one that was cheating on her while she was like, I think, pregnant or like dealing with cancer or like or something. I forget exactly what it was. But you know, this idea that you know, people are just so kind of like whimsical and flimsy and silly, where you could have like entire swaths of human beings that were in some way attached to you. They get taken away by some kind of event that's like completely out of your control. And they do it in kind of like a completely unthinking, unprincipled manner, right? They're not willing to remain to be friends with her simply because it creates a kind of awkwardness that they don't want to deal with. And so they go to where the power is. Where is the power? Well, now you have this new power couple of this cardiologist, or rather, I think he's a surgeon, actually. He's a heart surgeon, and Marion, you know, the high-powered philosopher. So they're going to go where the power is in some way. And the second part of this, so like, I also think it's, you know, it's a little bit darker. Like some of the themes in the film are a little bit darker than, you know, Marion simply, you know, made a bunch of rational decisions of her own free will. Well, you know, technically, of course, like she is making decisions of her own free will. I'm not exactly sure to what degree they are totally rational. And I think this is kind of underscored early on. So like when you know, like some of the conceit in the film is like where she's doing this book, and it's like next door to a psychiatrist's office. And so she hears like this patient come in, and the psychiatrist is talking to this patient, and again and again she enters into like these like dream states where she's kind of like resting, and it's almost this like, you know, hypnagogic kind of, you know, situation where she's half dreaming, she's half awake, and at some point after she runs into Claire, she has this kind of like hypnagogic quasi dream where Claire is actually the one arguing with Marion's husband, and Claire is clearly the stand-in for Marion. And I thought it was such a brilliant move on Woody's part that early in the film, to accentuate how repressed Marion is, you don't even show to the audience the arguments that she must be having with her husband. Instead, Claire is the one that is forced to be in Marion's shoes, arguing with Marion's husband, to accentuate, you know, how repressed Marion herself is. Like, we can't even see these arguments. And sure enough, like the first time we see a true argument between the two, it's this framing of the characters where they're walking down this very long, dark hallway, as if making to the end of it would mean that they have, you know, entered into some kind of abyss, right? Some point of no return, where from that point forward, their marriage is going to start to break down. Right. Yeah. So, I mean, there's a ton of like psychological depth there that just, you know, tells me there's a lot more going on with Marion that is, you know, there's a series of non-rational actions and thoughts that she kind of didn't even have necessarily all that, you know, perfect control over. And as the psychiatrist says, and this is, you know, this is her own mind telling her this, that, you know, she's not the type to commit suicide in the traditional sense. Instead, she's been slowly committing suicide from the very beginning, since childhood. You know, there's something deeper going on that she only starts to slightly work herself through by the end of the film.
Towards the end, it just seems like she's like, I'm trying to sort of repair.
Yeah.
relationships with people. It's yeah, it's a very bleak film, and it's mainly told through.
Well, it's inspirational it's aspirational, inspirational by the end, right? It's not bleak by the end, I don't think, but
no, that's what we were.
The buildup is definitely bleak. Yeah.
Yeah, the way the film progresses is depressing, but it has a sort of optimistic ending.
Yeah, so I watched Stardust Memories again, maybe like my fifth or sixth time watching it. What was like last night, and just before that, I rewatched 8.5. And yes, the 8.5 and Stardust Memories are different lengths. 8.5 is 45 minutes longer, but even with that additional length, I don't think it's hard to like it's hard to overstate how quickly Stardust Memory moves, right? It's so clever. There's so many images. There's so many things that you could point out, pick apart. It's a lot harder to do that with 8.5, right? And it's especially a problem given the fact that it's like 45 minutes longer, right? There's like it has many of the same features, right? Clearly, Stardust Memories is very much based on some of the structures and conceits of 8.5, but given the fact that there is just like a little less to talk about, and so many of the individual scenes in 8.5, it's definitely more of a slog to get through in some ways. But I surprisingly, like, I seem to enjoy it 8.5 more and more the more times that I watch it. This is my third time seeing it. First time it was just when I was first discovering film. Second time I watched it in preparation for my Woody Allen book when I was doing my Stardust Memories review, and then third time was in preparation for this conversation. And I mean, there's definitely you get more on individual viewings, which when it comes to like great art, that's just kind of like it's supposed to happen that way, right? You're supposed to see things unfold more and more, because by definition, great art is supposed to have complexity. It's supposed to have multiple layers. It's supposed to have depth, right? So you're supposed to unpeel it little by little in that way. But I think you agree with me and with Dan that Stardust Memories is a superior film in most respects.
Yeah, and it's I was saying to you how kind of odd that is, but in a way how telling that is as well, that the film is a kind of a pastiche of 8.5, and that it's a pastiche of the kind of Italian new wave cinema, and yet it's filled with all the same kind of qualities one would find in a really good Italian new wave film like 8.5. So it's the kind of the level at which kind of pastiche can actually take up and then surpass some of the aspects of the things that they're trying to imitate, they're trying to parody. I mean, a really crude kind of example is kind of like I don't know, Benny Hill or something, or maybe even a more contemporary example, something like Weird Al Yankovic, right? Who would do like these songs which were like parodies of popular sort of charting singles, but they would be but they would be more or less the same kind of song. They would have more or less the same kind of basic structure. They'd have the same kind of qualities that you find in the song, but they would just be, and so sometimes actually some of them would actually be, just as listenable, sometimes more listenable than and no less inane for like in the subject matter. Some of the songs would have a kind of ironic distance most of the time, or there'd be some disjunctive thing where it'd be like, making like Amish Paradise, like a gangster song about Amish people. There's a kind of a thing there, but so there's not always that genre deconstruction. Sometimes it's just the fact that kind of like picking up a style or a sheen, and then kind of using that to then go beyond the thing, while on the surface in a way kind of mocking or aping it. Benny Hill would do this too. He would do like these songs which are like parodies of kind of traditional Greek folk music songs, but they'd be more or less a pretty good, pretty listenable example, like Greek folk song. Like he's got a song called Pretty Greek Girl, or someone like rambling Sid Rumpo from the English musical scenes, who would do these innuendo-filled sort of musical folk ballads with all kinds of a sort of homosexual Polari double entendre, but they'd be actually pretty good examples of folk songs. So that Netherland-Witch comedy and pastiche can actually be used to do some pretty interesting or subversive things so this, it's a kind of a film that parodies new wave cinema, but it's actually a really good, if not one of the best examples of a kind of great new wave film. And does a better job at the kind of 8.5 maestro sort of maestro story, kind of better than that film does.
So both of these films, 8.5. The director there is Guido. In Stardust Memories, it's Sandy Bates. And so Guido is he's recovering at some kind of spa or other, right? He seems to be unhappy, right? Perhaps some of this is self-inflicted. Perhaps there's something else going on. He has a mistress. He has a wife. Interestingly, like, you never truly do understand in 8.5, where does the director stand in terms of where's Fellini on the question of, is this a talented artist, right? Yes or no? Does he have depth? Does he have something worthwhile to say? Fellini does put words into Guido's mouth, like, I have like so much to say, or I have nothing to say, and a strong desire to say it. A bunch of stuff that just is faux, artsy crap that doesn't really mean anything. But there's also lots and lots of critics, right? And there's both Stardust Memories and 8.5 have this freak show thing going on, where you have these caricatured characters are coming out. They all look kind of, they're maybe some fucked up in some way, maybe they're have weird faces, or maybe they're dressed in some weird way, or they're behaving in an odd fashion. And some of the freaks in the 8.5 freak show, they say things that are completely off the wall artistically. And I could tell that, it's Fellini's way, in terms of where he stands, he's sort of skewering some of these perspectives. Perhaps he's skewering some of the ways that, some of his other films might have been taken, or the films of other directors have been taken. And you have the same kind of idea in Stardust Memories, but in terms of what's the better film?
This kind of thing goes back to Proust, I think, or well, probably.
I've actually never read Proust, so maybe you could fill people in on that.
You could say even this sort of stuff appears in the Satyricon by Petronius. Kind of arguably one of the first novels, where you have. But yeah, that sense of kind of you're right. There's grotesque elements, but I'm also interested in these weird things. What occurred to me when I rewatched it recently is for instance. How it borrows other things from New Wave. In his house, in his apartment, on the wall, there's a mural of that famous photograph of the guy being executed. With
in Vietnam. Yeah,
I remember watching it and kind of just going,
yeah,
what the fuck is that doing there? I don't know what to feel about it. It's in a sense, I see it as.
Do you notice that the background is changing?
Yeah. That's I feel like that's maybe some sort of borrowed from a more kind of European art house, but in that context, it's still quite kind of interesting. Kind of the idea of the shifting mural, but it kind of does have a comic effect as well. Kind of when you see it, this guy with his dining room, his little modernist dining room with a big mural of kind of execution on the wall.
Comic as well as kind of psychologically revelatory, in the sense that, I mean, as the film opens, he's he's on the verge of some kind of nervous breakdown, almost suicidal, you could say, and you have that kind of photo, right? Later on,
you don't know whether to say it's a really subtle thing or a really fucking on the nose thing. It's interesting the way the film shifts between that sort of serious and quite buoyant light thing. I mean, it's not haphazard, and the moments of kind of seriousness, for instance, the prolonged sequence with Charlotte Rampling and her fragmentary speaking to the camera. You couldn't call it really a monologue, could you? But but other things are the sort of the lightness and the sort of like when he gets out of the car and he's greeted by all the fans from the cinema club who are all swamping him and like, I love your old funny movies, and like I'm trying to talk to him about the Marx Brothers, and it's like and it's just the one long tracking shot which goes from his point of view to breaking from it, and it that kind of balletic but like a smooth black and white kind of cinematography it feels very much from that kind of European new wave school, like all those sort of guys. You know, it's kind
except in this case, like, you know, when it comes to like black and white, if you're in the modern age, right, and you do a black and white film, you better have a decent artistic reason. And for Stardust Memories, like, I can't imagine this being colorized. This is a film that is so dependent on its kind of exaggerated dreamlike qualities that it just makes perfect sense to do a black and white film, you know, out of the themes and out of the characters, out of the caricatures. And just to go back to like 8.5 for a second, like even like the characters on like the respective freak shows that both films have, like the freak shows in Stardust Memories they're just much more clever, right? So many of those characters, they just say funny things, absurd things, ridiculous things.
Who are you what's your example of a freak show character from Stardust Memories, just specifically?
Like for example, when he visits his family, and then you're greeted by like the door opening, like, oh my god, and then like she has these like huge glasses that he goes to see I guess like his sisters, I guess it's, I forget who is, maybe it's a sister or cousin. He sees his like sister's husband, and he's like on this like bike. He was like, before getting this bike, I had 2 heart attacks. And he has this kind of like bell that's ringing, and she's like, stop it, I got it for him since Christmas, and he hasn't stopped, you know, like tinkling it since I got it. And then so Woody asks
I really like the scenes just where he's being harassed by his fan, like where he's trying to like make a phone call, and the guy keeps trying to like talk to him about the guy just won't leave him alone or whatever. I'm like, God.
But he's still, you know, like on a baseline level, he's still very respectful to everybody, and he oftentimes gives like very sage advice. Like when a former classmate confronts him and is like, hey, like, can you look at this or look at that? Like, I'm a cab driver now. And he was like, you know, like, this is just like all Sandy Bates says, like, you know, this is all just about luck, right? If I was an Apache Indian, my comic skills, they would not, you know, hold some sort of premium, right? Instead, I'd be killed, right? Because I was such a comedian. Whereas in this country, in this time period, I'm able to make money off of this, right? So even in those confrontations, so many of them are funny, but so many of them have a depth that you don't have that depth in 8.5, like in that when like the freaks confront Guido, they clearly want exactly what they want out of Sandy Bates and Stardust Memories, but there's much less rapport, there's much less give and take, there's much less that's revealed. Even something that's like a very brief interaction where he, like with this one like love interest that Sandy Bates has, they enter into like this like this like dark structure, I forget where it is, like on the beachfront, and suddenly like some woman like appears and she's like, I'm your mother. And you think for a second that perhaps this could be her mother. Like, he says nothing. It might be some kind of possibility, but you know, there is some kind of tension, Oedipal, or maybe like something else going on with his mother in the film and other films, right? If you want to extrapolate into the other movies a bit. And like that is like so heavy with implication, and just those few seconds, like there's a lot of richness there that, you know, Fellini doesn't really get to develop that all that much in 8.5.
Well, I agree. I mean, that's why I think sort of Stardust Memories is interesting, because it's a film that, out of all his filmography, it's a film that like it really closely models itself after 8.5, but in every way it seems to kind of surpass it. Kind of, you know, one has to say there's a lot to be said for Fellini's stylishness and his ability to have a, you know, his characters always have these manly turns of phrase, and like there's a really good story. I mean, I'll admit it's been years since I've seen 8.5, and it was such an ordeal at first when I was first getting into film to try and find a fucking copy with English subtitles. That when I did, kind of like my mission was done, I didn't return to it. Like but it is a a very sophisticated film, very good film. But Stardust Memories, I agree with you and Dan completely. It goes beyond its subject matter. Again, while trying to do what another film does, like while trying to, in a sense, kind of just like follow it up, answer it back, try and sort of meet it on its terms, which is an odd thing to see him doing, but kind of makes sense. Like again, like it's in that pastiche thing, that comic, like, you know, he goes from making Casino Royale and, you know, Bananas and these films which are parodies to now making films which are kind of and have that kind of I suppose satirical or sort of pastiche element to it, but have much more of a sophistication, much more an openness to, and a sort of an emotional realness too as well. I think like this is the thing we're saying about the films. There's a kind of emotionality that comes through, I think, as well in a lot of the characters, and even for a character who is kind of like you know, not unlike a lot of other Woody Allen characters that we've seen. Like it still feels like a fully three-dimensional human being with, like, you know, like again, like a child.
Specifically Sandy Bates? You mean specifically Sandy?
Yeah, like someone with a childhood, someone like with a history, someone with you know, I don't want to, like, next I'm going to be saying something corny like he has scars, but like, it's something like that. I mean, that like you're writing about kind of this this film is I think very on the money and very persuasive, especially when you describe scenes like where he's meeting the aliens who come down to tell him to just be funny. You know, like something which on its surface is something kind of stupid, but actually has a lot of poetry to it. It's almost like a scene from a Antoine de Saint-Exupéry novel, you know, like The Little Prince. It's sort of a really bizarre but beautiful metaphor, kind of like that's kind of existentialist but cuddly. You know, it's cute existentialism. I don't know, like maybe that's what Marx Brothers existentialism is. But it's like, you know, life is maybe meaningless, but hey, so what? You know, you've got that. I mean, what's the theme from Another Woman that we were talking about, which ties into so many other films? There was this, like, you know, life. You know, hey, you maybe don't get what you always want, but maybe you should settle. Maybe you should be okay with things. Is that maybe that's is that worse? Is that better or worse than dying alone or being alone? And then kind of like, what would being alone being like, and kind of like being left behind, like all this other stuff. I mean, this is where you see a kind of thing come out. When I was watching these Woody Allen films with my partner, and initially he was kind of like, these films are basically more or less the same. Kind of, it's the same kind of story, it's the same kind of guy. And I said, yeah, but I think, like, although there's kind of like the bare bones of something, kind of film to film, I think it's developing and it's going in new avenues. Sort of, he's taking it in new directions. So although we do get kind of a narrow slice of society, or we get kind of a very kind of male gaze, or we get Woody Allen, it's always being elaborated upon in very different and surprising ways. So from the very serious, almost tomb-like seriousness of something like Another Woman, to the much more kind of woozy, champagne kind of existentialism of Stardust Memories, kind of like, you know, where it's, you know, more so, and the way it ends too, on another note of optimism, but this very beautiful, I think, very cinematic thing where, you know, he looks in Charlotte Rampling's eyes and Stardust Memories plays. And I mean, I fucking hate Louis Armstrong, I'll say that much, but even I can recognize the beautiful tenderness.
It's a great scene. Yeah.
Beautiful.
And that's the thing. Like, yeah, when they're looking at one another, it starts like the camera starts on Woody Allen's face as he's describing his like,
and then you don't see
day, and then you don't see him at all. But you only see him by implication, because you see Dory's face. She's making faces at him.
Her seeing him. Yeah.
And you know that he must be making some kind of faces. He must be doing something to make her smile or laugh, right? And then
and that's precisely the moments you don't get in a lot of new wave cinema. A lot of new wave cinema is more about these kind of more elaborate flourishes sometimes, even for its so-called realism. Like these moments that you get with Woody Allen, that maybe he's bringing from Bergman, maybe from something else. Like, but that you know, the close-ups, the people's faces looking at one another, like you're saying all the time, the blocking, the way that you don't see figures. I mean, that's a crucial thing that I think he brings to the table, and that can come out in like a big way.
I think some of the Pygmalion connection is even more prominent
Mm,
for the reasons why it's so applicable to Woody Allen in this film compared to even some of the other films, because um, the one character that he seems to end up with, Isabel, right? She's the most mature one. She seems to be the best one for
yeah.
him, right? But again, she had those qualities all along, right? To whatever extent that he brings out some positives in her, she
Mm,
is someone that is strong from the beginning, right?
yeah.
And uh, there's this funny scene where like he's also in this kind of dreamscape, and he's kind of like, he looks like he's in the middle of some kind of sitcom, and he's building like Frankenstein's monster, right,
Yeah.
where he takes the brain out of like this one unattractive but totally sane and loving woman, and he puts that brain into the head of a woman that's like beautiful but
Yeah.
completely like insane and I guess like bad, right, in terms of being in a relationship with.
Yeah, he sees himself as caught between these two women.
Yeah,
And the aliens, when they come like
yeah,
interfere, like they talk about this too. They say like,
but yeah,
why are
but
you in this thing?
but I think speaking specifically to that Pygmalion thing, like,
Yeah,
and why some of the like straitjacket feminist readings don't work here is when he does make that switch of the brains, like the joke, like the punchline in that scene is like, so great, so you fell in love then with the beautiful, now beautiful and now good woman. It was like, no, I fell in love with the other one. Why? Because he's drawn to like the fuck up regardless, even
yeah,
if she's now like physically like unattractive. The fact that she's a fuck up, like he's totally drawn to that. So like I think in many respects, like the Pygmalion thing for the Woody Allen character is it's not that he's like chiseling someone out of marble. It's not even necessarily that he's like building anyone up. He is, you know,
exactly.
he is creating the complexities and the problems for himself. Like he's creating that difficulty. He wants that difficulty. That to him is the art. How do I navigate these landmines with this completely, crazy character?
Yeah,
Like it has,
in that
yeah.
sense, you're totally right to say that there's a
Yeah.
big connection with Pygmalion. Yeah,
Yeah, and like with husbands and wives, like there's that I forget her name, the woman that he was like in love with. He had this like early fling with. Like the
mm,
first time that you see her in the movie, like
mm,
she's not even doing anything crazy and she's not saying anything, but she just looks completely insane, right?
yeah, yeah,
And you could just tell like, wow, like I know why he's attracted to her, but the difference is like he's not merely attracted to these women. He wants to pursue relationships with them, which is the weird part, right? There's something like very
that's
like self-flagellating about it, right?
that's the part that really strains belief. Like Charlotte Rampling shacking up with Woody Allen. I mean, my God, like Charlotte Rampling's like one of those beautiful women who ever like it's crazy.
Well,
Like,
she's based on a what was her name, like Laura Loris or was it Doris or something? I forget. So he was with one woman for like a couple of years. I think he was married to her for a couple of years, and they were still friends after the marriage. But she was shocked when she saw like Stardust Memories, because so much of the Dory character, she said, was like based on her,
right.
right? So there's definitely been plenty of people of the Charlotte Rampling type, both in beauty and personality, that he did nab, right? And again, going back earlier, like, well, he's verbally good, he's talented, he's wealthy, and this is threatening because physically he's not the ideal, right, that women want. And to the extent that here's this guy that seems like he's undeserving of these kinds of women, nonetheless constantly shacking up with them, right? That's it's not so much that it's threatening, it just makes people mad. That shouldn't happen. I just finished reading Goethe's The Sorrows of Young Werther, and at some point, I'm not sure if
Fucking
you ever
hell, really? Jesus.
yeah, I mean, it's a pretty,
That's a tricky book.
it's a pretty shitty book, I think, overall. But there's this part where like Werther, like he's like writing his letters to Wilhelm, and he's like, I can't believe he starts to be like, I can't believe that she could love someone else. Like this kind, this kind of like imposition, right? And people view like the Woody Allen type as a de facto imposition of something that's like overly masculine, but it's coming from someone that is very disarming in the sense that he has nothing to show, for that masculinity, other than, the kind of like the brain stuff, the verbal stuff, the talent,
don't
the money.
get too mad. I'm just saying that like Charlotte Rampling's like a supermodel looking woman. Like she's good, especially like.
What do you mean mad? What do you mean mad? What do you think I'm getting mad at?
You're getting mad. You're like defending Woody Allen's honor. Like, listen, he's got the smarts. He's got the stuff. Like, we know. We've been over this. So I'm just saying.
Well, I'm not even framing this in terms of like deserving anyone. I'm just saying, as a matter of fact, why certain relationships are, happen. It seems like against all odds, right?
Yeah. No, totally. Like, I mean, I'm living proof of that. What was it's not a real urban film though, is it? In a sense. Like we don't get that kind of like urban. Like
it's more Long Island than urban.
Yeah. Long Island. I've never been to New York, so my sense of the geography in that regard.
But like these beaches and like suburban type, spots is what it looks like. Yeah.
Kind of like is Long Island where Coney Island is? Where's Coney Island?
Well, Coney Island is it's in Brooklyn, right? And it's attached like right to the south of Brooklyn. It used to be an actual island. They filled it up with like sand at some point, turned it into a peninsula essentially. But Long Island is just like on the outskirts. That's like where, like the Long Island Republicans are like the people that are, they're rich and perhaps racist and just kind of like living in their own world. Because if you think about it, it is like almost like 100 miles, I believe, of just kind of like disconnect. Like if you're able to live there and work there and not have to, head into the city to work, it is its own kind of completely disconnected world.
Sort of gated world. So it's kind of striking in that sense. We do get shots of sort of, although in a lot of scenes in Woody Allen films do take place in parks and sort of on walks and sort of en route to place to kind of even we were just talking about husbands and wives, and sort of we were talking about a scene where Woody Allen was talking to someone in a park on a walk kind of around kind of like, and it, so it's and there's a few scenes as well on where a lot of scenes in transit as well, in vehicles, people in taxis or kind of on trains or that sort of stuff.
The opening is on a train, right? The opening is that
the dream
movie
sequence
that he's making.
That's the allusion to it, 8.5, isn't it, as well? Like, but a lot of the scenes do take place in kind of like that sort of stuff too. Like it's that's what I like as well. It's not just people walking into rooms like and sort of saying each other's names. Like they're much more kind of active sort of the ways in which people's like, because I was saying like a lot of these films are melodramas, like a lot of the worst melodramas, and like I've seen my fair share of bad soap operas. People just walking into rooms and like saying one another's names, and every scene happening basically like that. But no, there does seem to be, like we were saying with this film, where you were talking about like the quickness, the flow, the fluidity of the film, how everything leads into one another with this real ease and fluidity, and how even some scenes might have sort of seem almost jarringly disconnected in sort of their tone, or like, but it flows nonetheless, and it doesn't. We don't feel that there's been some sort of serious interruption of kind of the integrity of the film overall. Kind of like its feeling of being like a film and not just a sporadic series of events. Kind of so, and we were talking about Pygmalion too. I mean, like I was just thinking, because recently I watched a lot of Woody Allen's recent filmography, like Mighty Aphrodite, well, relatively recent, Mighty Aphrodite, or then later what's it called, Whatever Works, the one he did with the Curb Your Enthusiasm guy, Larry David, and those are basically Pygmalion films. But like they are basically Pygmalion, but they're operating on a much more rudimentary level than the sort of thing we would get in Stardust Memories. And I don't know if it's because he's doing more things, whether the scale is bigger, because I mean the scale of a film like 8.5 is quite big. So when we look at what Woody Allen is taking from that film, I think it is in a sense a kind of scope, a scale, where it's a big film, it's a film about a film, it has all these moving parts, and I think maybe that's it. That's in a way kind of where his great period of filmmaking is far behind him now, but I think if he could go right anywhere, it would be more like that. It'd be to look more at cinema and try and look at more at how other filmmakers do things instead of, you know, getting caught up in his idiosyncrasy sometimes. Even though a lot of his films are about and being caught in habits and, you know, why do people do this and do that? It's, you know, once I still, and I think you too, notice a decline in his filmmaking. You're not going to get better than Stardust Memories.
No,
after this
yeah,
film.
I don't think
you
so.
might get other heights, but this is really the peak. And that's the problem as well. That kind of like Woody Allen's not going to come along with a new film anytime soon and change anyone's mind about how great of a filmmaker he is. But like we can make other more arguments for Stardust Memories. We can say kind of like, you know, it deserves to be reassessed and looked at as something that is in a way contending with 8.5 for a certain level.
Yeah, I mean the last like contemporary film of his that I've seen, it was like in 2017, Wonder Wheel. In fact, I was like sort of writing. I was sort of writing a review for it at the time. Then I was like, oh fuck it, like I don't want to like talk about this. Like it's just, you know, it's a little, not that it wasn't even necessarily like the worst of his, you know, new films. In fact, it did have some like good qualities, but you know, a lot of it just does get so unbelievably repetitive. Like it does get kind of pointless. But you know, eventually I'm gonna have to like re-release my Woody Allen book and you know, put everything in it, right? Like everything that he's done since that point, which is like since I believe like 2015 is when I end, or 2016 is when I end the book with Cafe Society. So, but I mean,
it would
like
be,
it's worthwhile.
It'd be interesting to do a kind of survey of those later films. I think because you know, there are moments in some of them for sure. I mean, we're going to talk about Midnight in Paris, and I think that's a film that has some interesting aspects and to it.
Yeah. Maybe we could also bring in like Manhattan a little bit into the discussion of Midnight in Paris. This is like another like city film, right? Another one of his like city films. So I mean, what do you think of Midnight in Paris?
I think it's a curious film. I think it is a good film. Yeah, we were talking about sort of this decline in Woody Allen's work, and definitely I don't think kind of Midnight in Paris is like a filmic statement like you'd have from like 8.5. It's you know, it kind of sets out to do something quite. There's a kind of cutesiness to like his films are from that period onwards, kind of very kind of twee, very unthreatening. You know, there's a lack of sort of danger or grit. There's never really the sense that anything terrible can happen to anybody. I mean, that's the irony of films like Whatever Works, or like it's like, you know, it's like Pygmalion if you stripped any kind of social context from it. You know, any poor people don't exist. You know, or if they do exist, then they're kind of, you know, like we're not asked to think about how they, you know, questions like subsistence or whatever, kind of everybody is just a professional kind of, and they get integrated into that world seamlessly. But in Midnight in Paris, we there's that introspection we get from Woody Allen, and we see his passions as well coming on to the forefront, his interest in literature and music and Cole Porter, I suppose, but Paris as well, and it's almost like he is with the film trying to kind of respond to Manhattan, or he's kind of like talking back to himself, making Manhattan. The film begins with a kind of montage over music of the city of Paris, so it's almost set up to kind of like be a kind of Manhattan version of Paris, but you know, it's obviously the story is very different, has a very different character, very different tone, and like we said, it lacks some of that grit, it lacks some of that that edge, but it does feel like an interesting response, and it does seem like a continuation of some of the things that we get in Woody Allen films. And I think it does do some things in the film that are quite interesting. The theme of nostalgia is kind of brought to the forefront with the film, and that's something that's always in the background of his other films, but here it's kind of put on display, and people's nostalgia and their kind of sentiments is kind of used as a theme in kind of line with those other things that we get in Woody Allen films, like, you know, people's social aspirations, you know, what they want, their romantic ideations of kind of like relationships and all that sort of stuff. Nostalgia becomes the thing here, and kind of people's the world people live in compared to the world people want to live in.
Mhm.
And you know, at a certain level, you can criticize Woody Allen in the film too, kind of like the Paris we get, the Paris he kind of brings us into with kind of these montages is beautiful, and it's all the Napoleonic statues. The Paris I know that I've been to stinks of piss, and is covered with graffiti. It's a beautiful city, but like, you know, same with Venice as well. People talk about the beauty of Venice. No one talks about kind of like the fucking reek of the place. It's so the film itself is of artificial contrivance, about artificial contrivances, about what, or about, you know, I don't know, like artifice in a sense, kind of an idealized fantasy world that kind of you know, is it better to live in a fantasy? What can one do by living through fantasy? Isn't that what being an artist is about? Like, is there a line one has to walk? You know, in one ways, this one can see that Owen Wilson, is it Owen Wilson? Yeah, Owen Wilson character as a kind of unlogical stand-in for a role that Woody Allen could have played in a when he was younger. But one can see how he brings his own sort of thing to the character. I mean, I don't think he's some sort of amazing performer compared to other performers, or even someone like Charlotte Rampling. Like, I think, but he does he does kind of fall into the Allen-esque, Woody-esque or whatever role quite easily with his mannerisms and his, you know, kind of like social awkwardness. So I think as a Woody Allen film, it's, you know, you can certainly do worse, but you know.
I mean, in general, like, first of all, I don't think very much of like Owen Wilson as an actor. And I think it's like really awkward seeing him playing like an intellectual or like artsy type, right? And it's also kind of weird because when you view him from like movie to movie, he's like the mannerisms are very similar, like the behavior is very it's to me it's very weird seeing him as a Woody Allen stand-in for various reasons. You mentioned that like opening montage that we get in Manhattan. We also get it here in Midnight in Paris. Here it's of Paris, obviously, and like even like. There are like obvious differences in what the strategy is with one film or the other with these montages. With Manhattan, by the end of the movie, you definitely get the sense that all these beautiful images, whether they are like conventionally beautiful or stark in some way, they are supposed to contrast with or somehow belie or refract and reflect some of the characters and the interactions within Manhattan. You don't get, you know, like the cliched love letter to Manhattan. You get something grittier, you know, like you alluded to. With Midnight in Paris, though, it's this thing where first of all, like it's technically, I mean, it's a very technically well done film. The montages are, you know, technically well done. They're alluring in some ways, but generally speaking, the shots are both highly representative of Paris and perhaps the kinds of things that artsy types might focus on in Paris. Like there's like a shot, for example, you know, of a lamp hanging off of a storefront. But
the Art Nouveau architecture,
I mean, these shots are very representative, but they're also extremely generic in many ways. And that wouldn't even be so much a problem because I guess maybe some of the Manhattan shots are a little bit generic too in terms of like what you choose to focus on. I don't really remember. I haven't seen that film in a couple of years, but the main difference between Manhattan and this is not even that part, but in the fact that one uses the montages for a specific kind of philosophical purpose. Here, I guess you do get a philosophical purpose, but like, what is that purpose? What is that comment? Is it to simply say, isn't Paris so romantic? You know, it's very superficial in that regard. So, you know, even in terms of like, if you want to just compare the opening itself, the opening is cute and well done, but it doesn't actually do anything of substance. And superficially, it merely looks like Manhattan, but beyond the superficial similarities, the two films, I think, diverge in any number of ways from that point on.
This is obviously the biggest problem with the film. It's a kind of I mean, it's difficult to say whether this was some sort of calculated choice or not, but the fact that it's a kind of a postcard image of Paris, but then seeks up to talk about all this like golden age.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, what was Paris really like? You know, what is Paris really like? You know, the idea is that Paris is just some cipher, can only
Mm-hmm.
be some cipher because, you know, but no, but if you go to Paris, it's like, you know, it's this very, it's this place which is like, has this whole history built into it with housemanism and then all this other, it's this thing which is very kind of, I mean, just I don't want to get caught up by the architecture of Paris, but there's a sense, I don't know, you said the philosophical purpose of like the beginning of like Manhattan. I mean, what do you think? Do you think just that it just has a philosophical kind of feeling, and it's like, or do you think it has a specific?
I think it's just I think it's belied by the content of the film itself, right? When you get to the substance of the interactions,
it's kind of like bathos. It's a kind of illusion. It's like, you know, like here's this big birthday wedding cake topper version of New York.
It's an illusion, right?
Down into, yeah,
like
okay,
it's an illusion and a contrast, right? The illusion is, isn't this so pretty and beautiful and wonderful? Don't you want to be in Manhattan?
Yes,
Meanwhile, the characters
is the problem,
within
maybe,
it, yeah.
that like there's this kind of bathos of like Manhattan, which we feel, you know, there's this distance, some levels of deconstruction, whereas it's more like where we're asked to accept the kind of the pathos of all the stuff that's going on in sort of Midnight in Paris. We're asked to go kind of like, oh yeah, really, kind of like, you know, we all love Paris a bit because kind of like we all grew up on the fantasy of it, and it's kind of like, well, Parisians don't, you know, like it's
I don't. You had negative experiences. I had negative experiences.
Yeah.
You're talking about it smells like piss. I added to those puddles of piss. I missed my train to Bordeaux one night in Paris, and I was walking around. It was like January. It was cold as fuck. I was walking around for like 12 hours until like 6 a.m. Finding construction sites to piss in, because that was the only place I could find to piss in.
I got fucking pickpocketed in Paris
by
someone with a fucking gold tooth. like that's the Paris I know. Like and people doing crappy caricature drawings outside of the Pompidou Center. You know, that's the Paris I know. But yeah, it in that sense, it does feel like some sort of really personal essay. Yes, I'm sure Paris doesn't look like this to Woody Allen when he's staying in the fucking fancy hotels and he's like going to the Louvre, and like that's the Paris he knows. But you know, like this is where the cracks start to come through, maybe. I think still though, when it does go into the past, and like it's more than just a kind of a lineup of famous figures, because you know, like you know, oh, there's Hemingway, there's this, like they're quite funny, interesting before, like the guy who plays Hemingway. I really like the performance of the guy who's Hemingway. Maybe it's just because I have this thing against Hemingway, so I quite like him.
You don't think they're just too caricatured? Like they're exactly like, in some ways they're like figments of Gil's imagination, right? Where he's like, oh my God, Gertrude's sign is. Yeah, Gertrude's sign is exactly how we, you know, read about her. And it's like, you know, I guess, but like, so are you going to spend like literally 1/3 of the movie presenting like caricatures from like literary, like pop interpretations of literary history? You know, that part, and also like, what the fuck would any of these people want to do with Gil? Like, here's like Picasso, who's like, oh yeah, you know, come in, hang out with me. Like, Picasso would probably want to smack him, you know, like in real life. It's just weird.
I think it. Yeah. I'll say this. I think it's more the sense, kind of like, you know, like if you are a practicing artist, and like you kind of do feel sometimes that you're locked in the room with 5 different schizoid entities that, like, you know, the ghosts of Picasso, this or that. So yeah, he you know, the whole idea is that he is in this kind of fantasy past, you know, who he travels back in time. He's talking to all these people, and he comes back and he's like, I was talking to Hemingway. He's like you and everyone kind of looks at him like he's a fucking cunt. Well, it kind of that's, you know, basically he is full of shit, and kind of like he's not traveling back in time, and like, but it is a kind of a false thing, and it's him kind of trying to talk back to the past, and the past actually kind of talking back to him in a way, and saying kind of to him, well, actually we were all really keen to get to the future, or else get back to our own imagined idea of the past. And it's something that he can only really find in that situation through going back to the past. You know, only through kind of lingering in this fantasy world can he kind of realize the way to break through it is kind of like, you know, to kind of like live in the present or whatever. And at the end of the film, he meets with this Parisian woman who he's like gets talking with about Cole Porter or something like, and in a sense he might form a real relationship with real roots in Paris. That's not just in this synthetic fantasy world of memorabilia, you know, stuff like books that he like. Just for instance, liking Hemingway is pretty fucking, you know, like, oh, you were Hemingway, the Hemingway, like fuck off, like come on, like it's really stereotypical. Like I'm like, oh my gosh, Hemingway's giving me advice, and even if you don't know who Hemingway is, or you don't know, but it seems goofy, and it seems like, you know, some guy meeting Batman, you know, kind of like, oh gosh, Batman, you know, like it. But then, you know, it's so in the and it's interesting because like what the Gertrude Stein character says, you've almost like written a science fiction novel. It is a kind of science fiction. You could easily make this story about a guy like, who goes into a VR world and kind of like realizes that he needs to find a real girlfriend or something like that, or something like that. It's kind of that, but instead of a virtual reality, we just get this guy's hazy, idealized golden age of a past, where his version of kind of these characters, but they're not satisfied. That even within the fantasy, they're not satisfied being his god, the woman, you know, that who is kind of, you know, this, you know, manic pixie dream girl, kind of dream, you know, artist she modeled for Picasso and all this sort of stuff. She, you know, she has her own kind of, you know, she's not just the drawing on the portrait. She has her own life. She has her own sort of world of nostalgia, and it's and I think that's an important thing. I think as a theme of the film, I think that the fact that like this will have been a thing that will have carried on throughout all time. This isn't just like a thing of our own like particular moment, our modern world, like where we go kind of like, oh, wouldn't it be better to be in a kind of world, you know, like what made everything made sense. At every point in history, there was someone was like anxious to get to kind of like either the future or to go to retreat back into the past. It's not something, you know, it's a human thing. It's not kind of, it doesn't matter where you are. Like people who were in Paris at one moment, they're living in a whole different city to people who were living in Paris 100 years ago, or kind of, you know, and even they didn't want to be like there, you know. The restlessness there. It's kind of like it's a cute version of the existentialism we get in Woody Allen. It's the existentialism with the edges sanded off. Maybe that's the problem here that we see when we look at Woody Allen. But you still see glimmers, I think, through things like that of the kind of the depth that isn't in Woody Allen, or like the fact that he's an artist and not just some hack.
I mean, there's definitely like a set of inversions that occur in the film that are interesting and curious for a couple different reasons. So like the main inversion, I guess, is the fact that Gil clearly has, you know, all this like golden age thinking, right, about you know, like about the past of Paris, just like the girl that he from the past that he falls in love with. She has her own kind of feelings about the golden age of Paris was actually not 1920, which is Gil's golden age, but 1890, right? That's her gold.
Fin de siècle, was it? Yeah.
The
Belle Époque, yeah.
Was that what it was?
The Belle Époque, yeah, the Moulin Rouge and Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec and all that stuff.
I don't have a lot of French, so I'll leave that to you. But basically, yeah. So you have this inversion, but a couple of things that are interesting about it. First of all, there's this character Paul, right, that his fiance ends up cheating on him with. And Paul, early on, he says something telling, right? He says that, oh, Gil is, you know, afflicted by this like golden age thinking. And Paul is supposed to be this like villain character, right? But he, you know, and he is like very one-dimensional in most respects, but he does end up
in most respects, yeah.
Yeah. He does end up making that one comment that ends up being like, you know, I guess one of the lessons and one of the inversions in the film, right? So it kind of like very slightly redeems him. Like, you know, Woody's characters, even if like, especially like near the end of his career, they're oftentimes kind of you know, they're pretty superficial in some ways, or they're like two-dimensional. Still, like there's still like an element or two that you could point to. Anyway, so that's the first part of it. The second part is, even if we say that there's like an inversion occurring and Gil, you know, I guess quasi recognizes that, hey, you know, I don't have to have golden age thinking. I could just be in love with the present today and look at this great new girl that I have in my arm. Well, even if you take that at face value, it is kind of telling that he is still so fixated on trying to escape California into Paris. That is another kind of golden age thinking. Like I'm personally like very kind of wary of, any person or any idea that, I just need to escape where I am. I need to go to a new city. I need to go to, especially to a new country. People that are very fixated on this kind of stuff, they are usually running from something. Like I've known so many people, like so many, like I'm sure you've known people like this too, right? That are constantly hopping from place to place to place. And yet internally, like it seems like nothing really changes within these people. There's a kind of like, so it's still, Woody is trying to do this artistic inversion, which you sort of have to do to make it, artistically of any kind of value. But he still can't help but, taking this like easy way out. That's not even a way out, right? You're still dealing with the same exact set of problems that you started with, right? Except, cosmetically, you just sort of changed it up a little bit.
It's also the theme of settling as well. You're right. I mean, I don't think there's any sense that kind of, you definitely could read it as something that could be like, not cyclical, but you trade one fantasy for another, or what have you. But then that's the kind of whole problem with the Woody Allen films, kind of we're talking about now, like where they seem to have the narrowness of the perspective becomes a bit more of a problem. Kind of like by keeping things in this sort of little microcosm of New York, this sort of world, like maybe we can but like a more kind of international vision of Woody Allen, it seems more and more kind of like postcard. It doesn't we come into some problems with it, so you're right, he does set up this theme of kind of living in the if not living in the moment, then not trying to kind of live in a kind of golden age. But you're right, kind of like if there's something kind of lacking in you, kind of is moving to Paris going to fill that lack, or is it another kind of golden thinking, another kind of wishy thinking? But I don't think the film tackles that sort of stuff. I think, like I was saying, like this is not as good a film as like the one stuff we get from his own golden age of filmmaking. So we have to kind of take it for what it's worth. But the qualities I do see it, as well. Let me be totally honest. Like my bias is for kind of like art produced in turn of the century Paris. Like I love all that kind of modernist shit. Picasso and Stein and all this shit. So I'm quite pleased to see those people appear as characters whenever they do appear. And I think the characterizations are probably not as exaggerated as we would otherwise think. I mean, this is sort of the problem with doing artistic types, especially those taken from a very particular moment in history where you have people like Salvador Dali, played by Adrian Brody. I mean, that scene doesn't really contribute to anything. But it's just a kind of like, oh, here's Salvador Dali. He was back then. And
it doesn't even capture anything of Dali that would make Dali. I mean, it's all cosmetic.
It kind of does sound exactly like the one of these kind of. He would kind of pawn off kind of weird, stupid phrases to people like
but that's what I mean. It's only like only the superficial part, exactly.
The appearance of Picasso is probably the most justified, because we can then have the scene later where Picasso
to move the plot along in that regard.
I think that's the best instance of a use of a thing where and probably I don't know, like it's an and it seems to be building off of kind of other scenes in Woody Allen films where they're, Woody and other characters, often women kind of he's dating, go into art galleries and talk about the art, or when women kind of are hooking up with artists, and just like we were talking about with Hannah and her sisters, the architect giving the tour to the two girls who are competing for his affections. And in this we have a very kind of intellectual kind of group of well-to-do people, and the guy and the character played by Michael, who is it? Is it Michael is it Michael Sheen, the actor? But he's playing this kind of like guy who's taking every opportunity to dick wave about kind of like, you know, his expertise and kind of like his education. And this scene where kind of like where Owen Wilson is able to like step in with this bit of information, and like because we've also had other scenes in like Woody Allen films where people try to use their education, or where people try to sound educated, or that, you know, they'll say the correct thing but they won't have confidence in what they're saying, or they'll say the wrong thing like completely confidently. Like people who are wrong can often be very confident in like the way they're wrong, like in Woody Allen film. But you know, in this, like the stuffy pretentious guy is often most of the time correct, or seemingly on one level well-meaning. Oh, I'll proofread your novel for you. I'll proofread this for you. And let me tell you about the definition of the word Versailles and all this other stuff. You know, he's like on paper he seems like a kind of charming guy, but in like in reality he's kind of this guy who is obviously dick waving and is obviously trying to like demasculate the other guy by kind of like, look, I'm this time-tenured intellectual, you're a Hollywood script writer. Like, let me be your mentor, let me be your Henry Higgins. Like, and then that pays off. That this pressure is released in the moment where kind of you know, he pulls the zinger and says kind of, no, this is actually a portrait of this other woman, not and his girlfriend is kind of offended by this, and she kind of like acts as if kind of he said something kind of like outrageous, like and like her whole body language, she turns to him, she's always like slightly towards
his fiance. I think one thing I will say about this film that I didn't notice before is you know, his like, so on the one hand, like his fiance is, I don't want to call her one-dimensional. She's very much a two-dimensional character. And the second dimension is the following. You know, she's obviously presented as a villain, right? She's supposed to be this kind of counterweight to Gil's like underdog point of view, right? Nobody in the film wants to like accept Gil's point of view, like his romance and whatnot. But the thing is, like, Gil's point of view deserves a whole lot of skewering that it doesn't really get sufficiently in the film. She's actually the only one that in like robust fashion again and again and again tries to skewer his point of view.
This is the point, and this is what I kind of like about her character, the fact that kind of, well, there's that, you know, I would probably kind of be a bit pissed off with Owen Wilson, kind of like
exactly. I was just thinking like not to justify.
Or you're not going to come dancing with me and my friends. You want to go on fucking walk,
like not to like justify anybody cheating on anybody else, but it's not really unexpected, right? That he'd get cheated on by this woman. Right. Like he is in many respects like pretty annoying. It's also, again, one of my like things about the films is it's not always clear as to whether the artists within the films are talented or not. The little bit of the novel that we get that he's working on doesn't really seem like that good to me, but I mean, who knows?
No. Well, I mean, wouldn't you be pissed off if he came back to you like and he was just Hemingway, and you fuck up like you have to like go to dinner so I mean maybe that's I quite, you know, how often do we get like really bitchy? I mean, we do get kind of slightly dysfunctional kind of highly strung women in Woody Allen films sometimes. We don't really get the kind of cold bitch all the time, like the kind of just like always kind of like snapping and kind of like just like, you know, like so in that you can tell that she's actually quite enjoying that role, but no, it's not a shine out nuanced performance, definitely. It's just these aren't really nuanced characters, and they're kind of like enjoyable comedic performances. I think Michael Sheen really likes the sleazy kind of like element of the character, and like when he's pronouncing Versailles, like the stress he puts on it, like ooh, I know French, Versailles, like, and then just like so yeah, like a much looser film than what we would get from the tightly bound, very intense filmmaking of Another Woman or Stardust Memories. but you know, there's glimmers of the old Woody in there, and like, whereas something in like, uh, whatever works, it's really kind of it's geriatric Woody. Like it's kind of like him, kind of like, oh, call my friends, I'll make a film. Like, yeah.
We should do some more of these like film shows. They're very kind of low stakes and a little more low effort on my part, because with the artifacts or whatever, I'm doing books. I have to read the stuff. I have to take so many notes. Here, I just watched a bunch of these movies again, took some notes, and here we are, right? A kind of like no pressure environment, but we could say a lot, right? There's a lot of stuff that comes out.
Yeah, definitely. Especially in the realms of like, you know, characters and narratives and all that sort of stuff. You can talk forever about that kind of shit.
Yeah.
Like, but I think you know the point in talk. I mean, like I was saying to you earlier, the reason I wanted to talk about Woody Allen is because it's precisely because of the thing that like people kind of don't feel the need to talk about him, or rather that he's not fashionable. So like, you know, there should be a little bit of talk about kind of like the merits of him as a filmmaker that kind of continues, because we see all that shit for all those other filmmakers, but not really for Allen. I mean, obviously he's doing better than both of us. Like, I mean, he's all right, but still, you know, it's like there's a kind of that you can see that there's a big question mark over his name in terms of like how people like look at what he's done over his life.
Yeah, I mean, people definitely underrate him and underestimate him. I mean, like just fucking think about it. He's literally like one of the top, you know, 5, if not like top 3 American filmmakers, if not filmmakers, period, the world over. And he's the only one that I can think of that does, you know, drama and comedy, you know, I don't want to say more or less equally well, because his greatest dramas are, you know, greater than the comedies, or although I guess Stardust Memories is kind of like a comedy drama.
Yeah,
but
and you can definitely see like Woody's influence on Dan Schneider's work, I think. Not just in plays or kind of like that sort of narrative kind of stuff, but the novels as well. Like I think kind of, you know, the whole idea of narrative, sort of Matryoshka doll narratives where people play other people's parts or things go alongside, or there are subtitles to people's thoughts. You know, like this sort of as well as the kind of the turning of biography into fiction and like fragmenting, kind of like, you know, putting oneself at the center sometimes. Like, you know, so the influence goes deeper than kind of like the stuff that like on the surface, like his ratings on kind of like on websites, whatever. Like the effect like on other artists is noticeable too.
Well, this was good. Let's talk for a few more minutes after I sort of say goodbye to the audience. Thank you guys for watching. If you're not subscribed, please subscribe. If you haven't hit like, please do so. I have another artifact coming up with Ava Schubert actually next week, so I should be uploading this soon, and then a week or so after that you guys are getting another artifact. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon.
Oh my God.